The constable's lantern swung low over the cobblestones, casting long shadows across the narrow passage between Whitechapel and Spitalfields. It was 3:30 in the morning, November 1888, and the fog had settled thick as wool over the eastern quarters of London. The gas lamps burned dim through the mist, their yellow glow barely penetrating the darkness that clung to the doorways and arched alcoves where the city's poorest sought shelter from the cold. Inspector Frederick Abberline of H Division stood motionless before the body, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The woman lay face upward on the damp stone, her arms spread wide as though she had been arranged with deliberate care. Her throat had been opened cleanly, professionally, and the blood had pooled beneath her in a shape that seemed almost intentional. But it was not the wound that held the inspector's attention. It was the mark left beside her, so drawn in her own blood upon the wall, a strange, sprawling pattern that resembled nothing so much as an enormous inkblot, symmetrical and precise. 3 women in 5 weeks, 3 bodies discovered in the early hours before dawn, 3 inkblots, each different, each rendered with the same careful hand. The newspapers had not yet learned of this detail. The police had kept its stores, hoping the pattern might reveal the killer's identity, but the city was already whispering, already afraid, and somewhere in the labyrinth of Victorian London's 10,000 streets, the artist was preparing his next canvas. Chapter 1. The Vigil of Gaslight. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night grows quiet now, and the world beyond your window has settled into that particular stillness that belongs only to the late hours. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever time rests upon your clock, know that you are safe here, in this moment, as we prepare to drift backward through the centuries together. If you have not yet done so, consider subscribing to this channel so that we might continue these journeys into history's shadowed corners, night after night, as the world sleeps around us. Let us now turn our attention to London. Not the London of gleaming towers and electric light, but the London of 1888, a city of 4 million souls pressed together in streets that had changed little since medieval times, a city where gaslight flickered against fog, where the Thames ran Johor black with the waste of industry, and where the divide between wealth and poverty could be measured in the distance of a single street crossing. The autumn of that year arrived cold and damp. By October the fog had become a permanent fixture over the eastern districts, rolling in from the river each evening to settle thick as morning crepe over Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Bethnal Green. These were the districts where London's poorest made their homes, if home could be called the cramped lodging houses that lined every major thoroughfare, or the workhouses that stood like fortresses at the edge of each parish. The Metropolitan Police force, established some 60 years prior, maintained order through a network of divisions spread across the city. H Division covered Whitechapel, a territory of narrow streets and courts where constables walked their beats in pairs after dark, their bullseye lanterns casting small circles of light against the encroaching darkness. Each man carried a wooden truncheon, a whistle, and little else. They wore dark blue uniforms and tall helmets that made them visible from a distance, which was both their protection and their limitation, for any criminal with sense could see them coming long before they arrived. Inspector Frederick George Abberline had been transferred to H Division in the early months of 1888. He was 45 years old, a career policeman who had risen through the ranks through methodical work and an ability to navigate the complex politics of Scotland Yard. He had spent 14 years working in Whitechapel earlier in his career, and knew its geography as well as any man alive, the courts that led nowhere, the passages that connected one street to another through the backs of buildings, the public houses where information could be bought for the price of a gin. The division's headquarters stood on Leman Street, a substantial building of brick and stone where sergeants kept watch through the night, where files accumulated in wooden cabinets, and where the telegraph connected them to the central office at Scotland Yard. Here, in rooms lit by gas mantles and heated inadequately by coal fires, The officers of H Division maintained their vigil over a territory that seemed to breed crime as naturally as the Thames bred fog. The streets themselves told the story of London's expansion. Whitechapel Road formed the main artery, wide enough for carriages and carts and lined with shops that catered to the Jewish immigrants who had flooded into the area over the previous decades, fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland. But step away from this thoroughfare into any of the side streets, Dorset Street, Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, and the city compressed into something medieval. Buildings leaned together overhead, blocking out what little daylight penetrated the fog. Courtyards opened unexpectedly, some containing only privies shared by dozens of residents, others holding small workshops where tailors and cobblers plied their trades in rooms barely large enough to turn around in. The lodging houses operated according to a brutal economics. For 4p, a person could rent a bed for the night in a dormitory room shared with 20 or 30 others. For 8p, a small private room might be had, though privacy was relative in buildings where walls were thin and doors rarely locked securely. Those without even 4p slept in the streets, in doorways, under arches, or in the workhouse casual wards where admission required the surrender of one's clothes and the performance of labour the following day. Women formed a significant portion of the street population after dark. Some sold flowers or matches, standing on corners until the early morning hours. Others sold themselves, negotiating prices in doorways and leading men into the courts and passages where privacy could be found for a few minutes. The police knew them, knew their names and their regular corners, knew which ones could be trusted to provide information and which ones would lie for a shilling. They were part of the landscape of night, as permanent as the gas lamps and as vulnerable as the flame within. The Metropolitan Police recorded everything. Each constable carried a notebook in which he logged the time and location of his observations throughout his shift. Sergeants compiled reports, inspectors reviewed files. The bureaucracy of law enforcement generated a constant stream of paper, occurrence books, charge sheets, witness statements, telegrams that flowed upward through the hierarchy toward the commissioners who oversaw the entire apparatus from their offices in Westminster. In the autumn of 1888, this system functioned as it always had. Constables walked their beats. Drunks were taken to the cells to sleep off their gin. Fights were broken up. Stolen goods were recovered. The machinery of justice ground forward, processing the minor crimes and disturbances that form the texture of daily life in the East End. But there existed, even then, a tension beneath the surface. The previous year had seen demonstrations by the unemployed, crowds gathering in Trafalgar Square to demand work and bread, confrontations with police that had turned violent. The newspapers, which multiplied yearly as printing costs fell and literacy rose, fed upon sea stories of crime and disorder, finding in the East End an inexhaustible source of material that confirmed their middle-class readers' fears about the dangerous classes who lived beyond the boundary of respectability. The social reformers came too, middle-class men and women who ventured into Whitechapel to document the conditions they found there. They wrote pamphlets and gave lectures, describing rookeries and bums, counting the number of persons per room, calculating the death rates from disease and malnutrition. Some came with genuine compassion, hoping to improve conditions through legislation or charity. Others came as tourists of poverty, seeking the thrill of glimpsing how the other half lived before returning to their comfortable homes in the western districts. Through all of this, the police maintained their watch. They knew that crime flourished in darkness and poverty, knew that their presence deterred some offences while others continued regardless. They knew the limitations of their power, knew that they could not be everywhere at once, that crimes committed in the privacy of lodging rooms or in the shadows of unlit courts often went unreported and unpunished. The fog grew thicker as October advanced. It was the particular curse of London, this fog, not simply mist, but a dense mixture of water vapour and coal smoke that reduced visibility to a few feet and left a coating of grime on everything it touched. On the worst nights, traffic slowed to a crawl, horses feeling their way forward while drivers called out warnings to avoid collisions. Pedestrians navigated by memory and by following the iron railings that fronted most buildings, their footsteps echoing strangely in the muffled air. In such conditions, the gas lamps became beacons of civilization. Each lamp required daily maintenance, the lighting at dusk, the extinguishing at dawn, the replacement of mantles, and the cleaning of glass. Lamplighters made their rounds with long poles, bringing flame to the jets that burned through the night. Between these pools of light, darkness reigned absolute, and it was in this darkness that the city's predators moved. The constables knew this. They carried their lanterns and walked their routes, checking doors, peering into courts, listening for sounds of disturbance. They knew the locations where trouble typically occurred: the public houses at closing time, the corners where prostitutes gathered, the lodging houses known for harbouring criminals. They had learned through years of experience to read the streets, to sense when something was wrong, when the normal pattern of night had been disrupted. It was in this atmosphere, fog-bound, gas-lit, watched over by police whose powers were limited by darkness and geography, that the autumn of 1888 unfolded. The city continued its routines, the great machine of commerce and industry turning regardless of weather or season. Ships unloaded at the docks, factories operated around the clock, markets opened before dawn, and through it all, 4 million people pursued their individual struggles for survival, for comfort, for meaning in a world that seemed to care little for any single life. The vigil continued night after night as it had for decades. The constables walked their beats. The inspectors reviewed their reports. The machinery of law enforcement maintained its watch over the eastern districts, confident in its systems and procedures, unaware that these systems were about to be tested in ways no one had anticipated. For somewhere in those fog-shrouded streets, someone moved with purpose, so someone who understood the geography of darkness, who knew the rhythms of the night, who had begun to conceive of murder, not as a crime of passion or profit, but as something else entirely, something that would require a new vocabulary, a new understanding of what one human being might do to another. The gas lamps burned, the fog pressed close, and the city, unknowing, waited. Chapter 2. The First Canvas. The body was discovered at 3:30 in the morning on the 31st of August 1888. Charles Cross, a carman employed by Pickfords, was walking along Bucks Row on his way to work when he noticed what appeared to be a tarpaulin lying across the gateway to a stable yard. The street was dark, the nearest gas lamp standing some distance away, and Cross approached cautiously, uncertain what he was seeing. As he drew closer, he realised it was not canvas but a woman, lying on her back with her skirts pushed up around her waist. At that moment, another man appeared from the direction of Brady Street. Robert Paul, also a carman, also making his way to work in the early morning darkness. Cross called out to him, and together they bent over the figure. Paul placed his hand against the woman's face and found it warm, though he could detect no breath. Her hands were cold. They debated whether she was dead or merely drunk, a common enough sight in these streets. Neither man had a light. Neither wished to become more involved than necessary. They agreed to find a policeman and hurried away toward Baker's Row. Police Constable John Neal was walking his beat along Bucks Row when his bullseye lantern caught the shape lying in the gateway. He had passed this spot approximately 30 minutes earlier and seen nothing. Now he stood over the body of a woman, her throat cut so deeply that the vertebrae were visible. Blood had pooled beneath her, spreading across the cobblestones in the distinctive pattern that would later occupy so many hours of police discussion and investigation. Neal used his whistle to summon assistance. Police Constable John Thane, patrolling the adjoining beat, arrived within minutes. Neal sent him to fetch Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, whose surgery stood on Whitechapel Road, a short distance from the scene. Thane ran through the empty streets, his footsteps echoing off the brick facades, and returned with a doctor within a quarter of an hour. Llewellyn conducted his examination by lantern light there in the gateway, with the constables standing watch around him. The woman was dead, had been dead perhaps half an hour, though determining time of death with any precision was beyond the medical science of the era. Her throat had been severed by 2 cuts, one above the other. both delivered from left to right. Her clothing had been disturbed, her skirts pushed upward, but whether by the killer or by her own actions was unclear. The doctor ordered the body removed to the mortuary, and constables loaded her onto an ambulance cart for the short journey to Old Montague Street. It was only later, when the mortuary keeper began the process of stripping the body for examination, that the full extent of the injuries became apparent. The woman's abdomen had been opened with a long, deep cut, and there were several other incisions across the lower torso, delivered with enough force to penetrate to the organs beneath. But there was something else, something that the police would keep from the newspapers in those first days. On the brick wall of the gateway, approximately 3 feet from where the body had lain, someone had drawn a mark in blood. It was not writing, not any recognizable symbol. It resembled an ink blot, the kind that might be made by pressing paper against a fresh ink stain and opening it to reveal a symmetrical pattern. The mark stood roughly 8 inches across, the blood still wet enough to gleam in the lantern light, carefully rendered despite the darkness and the haste with which the killer must have worked. Inspector Joseph Helson of J Division arrived at the mortuary later that morning to take charge of the investigation. He examined the body again in better light, noting the nature of the wounds, the deliberate quality of the cuts. Dr. Llewellyn, who performed a more thorough examination in the mortuary's cold room, reported that the weapon was likely a knife with a blade of moderate length, 6 to 8 inches perhaps, and that whoever wielded it possessed some keen knowledge of anatomy, given the precision with which the abdominal cavity had been opened. The woman's identity was established through the markings on her undergarments. Mary Ann Nichols, known to her associates as Polly, 42 years old, estranged from her husband, a resident of various lodging houses in the Whitechapel area. She had been turned away from her usual lodging house on Thrall Street earlier that night, lacking the 4pence required for a bed. The deputy keeper remembered her leaving around 1:30, saying she would soon earn the money. She had been drunk but not incapacitated, and she wore a new bonnet of which she seemed proud. The police began their inquiries with the systematic approach that characterised Victorian law enforcement. They interviewed the men who found the body, the constables who first arrived at the scene, the residents of Bucks Row who might have heard something during the crucial hours. They compiled a list of known prostitutes in the area, recording their whereabouts that night. They sent telegrams to other divisions requesting information about similar crimes. But it was the mark on the wall that troubled Inspector Helson most. He had ordered it photographed before it was washed away, though photography in low light remained an uncertain art, and the results were poor. He had constables make sketches, attempting to capture the exact shape and proportions. He consulted with superiors at Scotland Yard, describing what had been found, asking if any similar markings had been reported in other cases. No one had seen such a thing before. Criminal marks were not unknown. Thieves sometimes left symbols to indicate a house had been surveyed or robbed. But those were simple scratches or chalk marks, not elaborate patterns drawn in the victim's own blood. This suggested something different, something that spoke to motive beyond robbery or simple violence. The newspapers learned of the murder by mid-morning. By afternoon, reporters had gathered outside the mortuary interviewing anyone who would speak to them. The initial reports focused on the brutality of the crime, the vulnerability of women forced to walk the streets at night, the inadequacy of police protection in the East End. Editorial writers called for better lighting, more constables, stricter enforcement of laws against prostitution. But the newspapers knew nothing of the Inkblot. That detail remained confined to police files, shared only among the investigating officers and the senior officials at Scotland Yard. It was policy to withhold certain information from the press, details that might prove useful in identifying the genuine perpetrator should anyone come forward claiming responsibility. In an era when confession was still the primary means of securing conviction, such strategic silence was considered sound practice. Inspector Abberline read the reports from his office on Leman Street. Though the murder had occurred in J Division's territory, just across the boundary from his own, he recognised the location, knew the geography of Bucks Row and the surrounding streets. He noted the systematic nature of the crime, the evidence of planning in the choice of location, a gateway that provided concealment from the street, yet allowed quick escape through multiple routes. He noted too the time of the murder, occurring in that window between the last drunks stumbling home and the first workers setting out for their shifts. The killer had understood the rhythms of the street, had known when the constables would be at the furthest points of their beats, when the greatest span of time would elapse between one patrol and the next. The investigation proceeded through the standard channels. Detectives interviewed known criminals with histories of violence against women. They checked the registers of lodging houses for men who had arrived covered in blood or acting suspiciously. They sent inquiries to asylums and hospitals, seeking patients recently released or escaped who might possess the medical knowledge suggested by the nature of the wounds. The East End had no shortage of violent men. The files contained hundreds of names, men convicted of assault, of wounding, of attempted murder. But most such crimes were impulsive, driven by drink or passion, committed against wives or associates with whom the perpetrator had some existing relationship. This murder suggested something else, a stranger selecting a victim apparently at random, killing with a combination of violence and care that seemed almost contradictory. Mary Ann Nichols was buried on the 7th of September. Her funeral attended by a small crowd of curious onlookers and a few individuals who had known her in life. Her estranged husband identified the body, weeping despite their long separation. The newspapers published her history: 5 children, a marriage destroyed by drink, years of decline into poverty and prostitution. She became briefly an object of public sympathy, an example of how far a woman might fall in a city that offered little mercy to the fallen. The police continued their investigation, but without witnesses, without any clear motive, without even a reliable description of who might have been seen in Bucks Row during the relevant hours, they had little to pursue. The mark on the wall remained unexplained. Constables were instructed to watch for similar markings, to report immediately if any were found. Detectives hoped this was an isolated incident, the act of a madman who might be identified through the hospital and asylum records. They were wrong, but in those first days of September, as the investigation slowly ground forward through its routine procedures, no one yet understood what had truly begun. The files accumulated on Inspector Helson's desk. The telegrams went back and forth between divisions, the newspapers moved on to other stories, and in the lodging houses and courts of Whitechapel, life continued as it always had, the women still needing to earn their fourpence, still walking the dark streets in the hours before dawn. The first canvas had been completed. The artist, if such he could be called, had proven his skill. The symmetry of the inkblot, rendered in blood on brick, waited in the police files like a promise or a warning. And somewhere in London's 4 million souls, one person knew what it meant. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Shadow. Whitechapel in 1888 occupied roughly 1 square mile of London's eastern sprawl, bounded approximately by Commercial Road to the south, Bishopsgate to the west, and bleeding gradually into Spitalfields and Mile End as one travelled east and north. But these boundaries were administrative conveniences, lines drawn on maps that meant little to those who lived within them. The reality was a warren of streets and courts that had accumulated over centuries, layer upon layer of construction and reconstruction, expansion and subdivision, until the resulting geography resembled nothing so much as a maze designed by committee and necessity. The main thoroughfares, Whitechapel Road, Commercial Street, Leman Street, were wide enough for wagons to pass, lined with shops whose proprietors lived above their premises. Gas lamps stood at regular intervals, and constables maintained a visible presence during daylight hours. These streets presented the face of respectability, of commerce and industry, of a district that functioned within the broader economy of London. But step through any archway, duck under any passage, turn down any of the side streets, and the character changed entirely. Here the buildings pressed close, many dating from the previous century or earlier, timber frame structures that leaned against their neighbours for support. Courtyards opened without warning, some containing only a water pump and privy shared by residents of the surrounding tenements. Passages connected one street to another, narrow channels barely wide enough for a handcart, some covered by the upper stories of buildings that had been extended overhead. The lodging houses formed the economic foundation of the district. These were not hotels or inns in any recognisable sense, but large buildings subdivided into the smallest possible units that could still be rented. A typical lodging house might contain 50 or 60 beds, arranged in dormitories where privacy was unknown and theft was common. The beds themselves were simple frames strung with rope or cheap canvas, placed so close together that one could not pass between them. Residents paid nightly, and those who could not pay were turned out onto the street regardless of hour or weather. Some lodging houses catered to specific populations. Several accepted only Jewish immigrants, providing kosher meals and maintaining Sabbath restrictions. Others housed primarily Irish labourers who worked in the docks or the building trades. Still others made no distinctions, accepting anyone who could produce the required coins. The deputy keepers, men and women who managed the houses for absentee landlords, maintained order through force and the threat of eviction. They knew their residents by name and habit, knew who could be trusted and who bore watching, knew which beds were preferred and which corner of which room was avoided, because the roof leaked or the cold penetrated most severely. The streets themselves possessed a logic that became apparent only through experience. Flower and Dean Street was known as the most dangerous thoroughfare in London. A distinction earned through decades of crime and squalor, the police walked it only in pairs, and even then avoided lingering. Its lodging houses harboured thieves and prostitutes, fugitives and the desperate, creating a density of criminal activity that resisted all efforts at reform. Social investigators who ventured there described conditions that seemed medieval, buildings so decrepit they should have been condemned, sanitation so inadequate that disease spread like fire through dry timber. Dorset Street ran as a parallel to Commercial Street, a narrow lane of lodging houses and small shops where violence erupted regularly, and the police were called several times each week. Miller's Court opened off Dorset Street, accessed through a narrow passageway barely 3 feet wide. The court contained 6 small buildings subdivided into rooms rented individually, creating a contained world where residents knew each other's business with an intimacy born of proximity and poverty. Thrall Street, Fashion Street, Wentworth Street, each possessed its own character, its own hierarchy of respectability or degradation. Some streets maintained a veneer of order, their buildings well kept, their residents employed in legitimate trades. Others had descended into near complete dereliction, their houses filled with the transient and the hopeless, their courtyards repositories for refuse that no one bothered to clear. The Jewish community had transformed portions of Whitechapel over the preceding decades. Synagogues occupied former churches and warehouses. Yiddish could be heard as commonly as English in some districts. Small workshops proliferated, employing immigrants in tailoring and bootmaking, the sewing machines running from dawn until late into the night. The Jewish residents generally kept to themselves, maintaining their own charitable organizations and social structures, regarded with suspicion by some of the older English population, but valued by landlords for their reliability in paying rent. The public houses provided social centres for those with money to spend. Every major street boasted multiple establishments, some respectable enough to welcome local tradesmen, others catering to the roughest elements of dock workers and casual labourers. They opened early and closed late, dispensed gin and beer in quantities that shocked middle-class observers, and served as clearinghouses for information, gossip and criminal enterprise. The police knew the publicans, many of whom served as informal sources, passing along whispers about stolen goods or violent men. The churches maintained their presence as well. Christchurch Spitalfields, built in the previous century, still dominated the skyline with its distinctive tower. St Mary's Whitechapel gave its name to the district. Smaller missions and charitable organisations operated from converted buildings, offering soup kitchens and temporary shelter, attempting to provide alternatives to the workhouse and the street. The Salvation Army had established a presence, its uniformed members distributing food and preaching salvation to audiences that came primarily for the food. The workhouse stood as the institution of last resort. The Whitechapel Union Workhouse on Baker's Row could house several hundred individuals in conditions of enforced discipline. Admission required the surrender of all possessions and clothing, separation of families, and mandatory labour in exchange for meals and a bed. The casual wards accepted those seeking only a night's shelter, but even this required work the following morning, oakum picking or stone breaking, tasks designed to be unpleasant enough to discourage all but the truly desperate. Water came from street pumps, most connected to the municipal supply but some still drawing from wells of uncertain purity. Sanitation remained primitive, with most buildings relying on privies that emptied into cesspits, or in better cases, into the sewers that had been constructed decades earlier. The night soil men still made their rounds in some courts, collecting human waste for sale as fertilizer. Disease was endemic, particularly in summer when the heat intensified the stench and flies multiplied beyond counting. The architecture itself told the history of London's expansion. Medieval timber frames stood next to Georgian brick. Victorian warehouses overshadowed both. Buildings had been extended upward and outward, creating overhangs and lean-tos that blocked light and trapped smoke. Courtyards that had once been gardens or stable yards had been filled with structures, narrow buildings squeezed into any available space to maximize rental income. Navigation required local knowledge. Street signs existed but were unreliable. Many courts and passages had no official names, being known only by custom. Tiger Bay, Miller's Court, George Yard. A stranger could become lost within minutes, the turnings and passages creating a disorientation that locals exploited. Thieves knew which routes offered escape, which courtyards led to multiple exits, which buildings had back staircases or connections between floors that allowed movement unseen. The density of population defied easy comprehension. In a single building in Flower and Dean Street, investigators counted over 100 residents. In certain courts, families of 6 or 8 occupied single rooms measuring perhaps 10 feet square, sharing beds in shifts to accommodate work schedules. Privacy was impossible, personal space a luxury unknown to most residents. Children grew up in these conditions, playing in streets where horse traffic and cart traffic created constant danger, learning the geography of poverty from their first steps. Yet within this apparent chaos existed order of a sort. The residents knew each other, recognized outsiders immediately. The deputy keepers knew who belonged in their houses and who did not. The prostitutes worked regular corners, respected each other's territory, maintained relationships with local publicans who tolerated their presence. The criminals operated within understood parameters, avoiding certain streets where police presence was too heavy, favouring others where escape routes were numerous. For the police, this geography presented challenges that no amount of training could fully address. A constable walking his beat knew the main streets but could not know every court and passage. Pursuits ended regularly when suspects disappeared into buildings that connected to other buildings, emerging streets away from where they had entered. Witnesses were difficult to find and more difficult to trust, knowing that a cooperation with police might bring retaliation from neighbours. Inspector Abberline, with his years of experience in Whitechapel, understood this better than most. He knew which lodging house deputy keepers could be pressured for information, which publicans might be persuaded to share what they heard, which prostitutes might be convinced to report on unusual customers. He knew that investigation in the East End required patience and persistence, that cases were rarely solved through dramatic breakthroughs, but rather through the slow accumulation of small pieces of information. The architecture of shadow, then, was both physical and social. The buildings created literal darkness, spaces where gaslight never penetrated, where what happened could not be seen from the street. But the social structure created darkness too, a conspiracy of silence born from fear and mistrust, from the knowledge that cooperation with authority brought no reward and potential harm. Into this labyrinth someone had introduced murder of a particularly calculated nature, someone who understood the geography as well as any resident, who knew when the streets would be most empty, where concealment could be found, how to appear and disappear without drawing attention. Someone who had stood in Buck's Row in the hours before dawn and taken the time, despite the risk, to draw a careful pattern on a wall in blood. The city continued its rhythms, indifferent to one death among so many. The lodging houses filled and emptied each night. The markets opened before dawn. The factories consumed their workers and produced their goods. And through it all, the streets and courts of Whitechapel maintained their secrets, keeping their counsel, while the police compiled their files and the newspapers speculated endlessly about what manner of creature walked among them. Chapter 4. The second mark. The discovery came at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of September. John Davis, an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street, descended the stairs from his third-floor room with the intention of visiting the privy in the backyard. The building, like many in Spitalfields, had been subdivided into rooms rented by the week, with 17 residents sharing a single outdoor toilet and water pump. Davis opened the back door and stepped into the yard, a space perhaps 15 feet square, enclosed by wooden fencing that separated it from the yards of neighbouring houses. The woman lay against the fence on the left side of the yard, positioned between the steps that led down from the door and the fence itself. Her head was turned toward the house, her left arm resting across her left breast, her legs drawn up with the knees turned outward. Davis, whose eyesight was failing, initially thought someone had been taken ill. Then he saw the blood, darker than the morning shadow, pooling beneath the body and soaking into the packed earth of the yard. He ran through the house, shouting for help, and emerged onto Hanbury Street, where he found 2 men passing by on their way to work at the Spitalfields market. They returned with him to the yard, confirmed what he had seen, and one ran to fetch police while the other remained to guard the scene. Within minutes, several local residents had gathered at the back door, craning to see into the yard, and Davis was obliged to keep them from entering. Inspector Joseph Chandler of H Division arrived by 6:15, having been on duty at Commercial Street Police Station, when word reached him. He immediately sent for Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, and ordered constables to clear the house and secure the area. By the time Dr. Phillips arrived at 6:30, a considerable crowd had assembled in Hanbury Street, drawn by the news that another woman had been found murdered. The body presented injuries more extensive than those inflicted upon Mary Ann Nichols. The throat had been severed deeply, the head nearly separated from the body by the force of the cuts, but it was the abdominal injuries that drew Dr. Phillips's particular attention. The entire abdomen had been opened, the intestines lifted out and draped over the right shoulder. Portions of the abdominal wall and certain organs had been removed entirely, and were not present in the yard. The woman's skirts had been pulled up around her waist, but her clothing otherwise remained largely intact. Near her feet, as arranged with apparent care, lay several items, 2 combs and a piece of muslin. A leather apron, wet with water as though recently rinsed, lay near the water pump. On the fence above where the body rested, approximately 2 feet above the head, someone had drawn a mark. This second inkblot was larger than the first, measuring perhaps 12 inches across. It had been drawn in blood, the pattern symmetrical, resembling the spread wings of some enormous insect, or the branching of a tree rendered in mirror image. The blood had dried partially in the morning air, giving the mark a brown, rust-coloured appearance. Unlike the mark in Buck's Row, which had been discovered after the body was removed, this one was immediately visible to everyone who examined the scene. Inspector Chandler ordered it photographed at once, though the light in the yard was poor and the fence itself was old, weathered wood that absorbed the blood unevenly. He had constables make detailed sketches from multiple angles, measuring the dimensions and noting its position relative to the body. He ordered the fence panel removed for preservation, before any rain or weather could damage the mark further. Dr. Phillips conducted his examination in the yard, kneeling beside the body, noting the position of each injury, the angle of each cut. He remarked to Inspector Chandler that the removal of certain organs would have required anatomical knowledge, that the cuts were made with confidence, that the work had been done with sufficient light to see clearly what was being done. given the darkness of the yard, this suggested either the murderer possessed exceptional night vision or had brought some form of illumination with him. The woman's identity was established by mid-morning. Annie Chapman, known to her associates as Dark Annie, 47 years old, estranged from her husband who had died the previous year, a resident of Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street. The deputy keeper, Timothy Donovan, remembered her leaving around 2 o'clock that morning after he had refused to let her stay without payment. She had been drunk and ill, suffering from chronic lung disease and malnutrition, but she had assured him she would soon have her DOS money. The police interviewed residents of 29 Hanbury Street throughout the morning. The house had been occupied throughout the night, people coming and going using the yard at various times. Yet no one had heard anything unusual. No scream, no sounds of struggle. The yard was used communally, and residents took no particular notice of who might be outside at any given hour. Several stated they had heard voices in the yard around 5:30, but voices in yards were unremarkable and drew no special attention. Kadosh, who lived next door at number 27, had heard a voice say no from the direction of the yard around 5:30, followed by the sound of something falling against the fence. He had thought nothing of it at the time, such sounds being common enough in densely populated districts. Only later did he understand he had likely heard Annie Chapman's murder occurring mere feet from where he stood. Inspector Abberline, notified of the second murder, travelled from Lemon Street to Hanbury Street by mid-morning. He examined the body before its removal, studied the mark on the fence, reviewed the initial statements taken from witnesses. The similarities to the Bucks Row murder were unmistakable. The throat cut, the abdominal mutilation, the arrangement of the body, and most significantly, the careful rendering of an inkblot pattern in the victim's blood. 2 murders in 8 days, 2 women killed in the early morning hours in the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, 2 inkblots, each different in detail but sharing the same symmetrical quality, the same deliberate execution. This was no longer an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and pattern suggested purpose. The investigation shifted into higher urgency. Scotland Yard assigned additional detectives to H Division. Rewards were posted for information leading to arrest. The newspapers, which had given modest coverage to the Bucks Row murder, now devoted front pages to what they termed the Whitechapel murders. Reporters interviewed everyone who had known Annie Chapman, documenting her decline from respectability into poverty and prostitution, finding in her history another tale of how the city consumed its weakest members. But it was the mark on the fence that occupied the most discussion among the investigating officers. Inspector Abberline had the photographs from both crime scenes placed side by side. The patterns were different, the first resembling perhaps a butterfly or flower, the second more like branching roots or lightning, but both possessed the same symmetrical structure, the same careful execution. This was not random smearing or accidental marks. These were deliberate designs, drawn with purpose, left as some form of signature or statement. Dr. Phillips provided his full report later that day. Death had occurred perhaps 2 hours before the body was discovered, placing the time of murder around 4 o'clock in the morning. The weapon was likely a knife with a thin blade at least 6 inches long, possibly longer. The killer had medical knowledge, or at least practical experience with anatomy, given the efficiency with which organs had been removed. The entire procedure, from first cut to completion, had likely taken no more than 15 minutes, perhaps less. 15 minutes in a yard accessible to 17 residents, with neighbouring houses on all sides, in a district where people rose early for work and the streets began filling by 5 o'clock. Yet the killer had worked undisturbed, taking the time not only to inflict his injuries but also to arrange the body, to draw his mark upon the fence, to remove certain items from the scene entirely. This spoke to extraordinary nerve or complete familiarity with the rhythms of the street, knowing precisely how much time was available before discovery became likely. The police deployed constables throughout Whitechapel and Spitalfields, increasing patrols, instructing officers to stop and question any man seen with blood on his clothing or acting suspiciously. They interviewed butchers and slaughterhouse workers, anyone whose occupation might provide both the skill and the callousness required for such acts. They checked recent admissions to asylums, seeking patients who had escaped or been released despite remaining dangerous. The Jewish community came under particular scrutiny. The leather apron found near the water pump was of a type worn by leather workers and butchers, many of whom were Jewish immigrants. Anonymous letters began arriving at police stations and newspaper offices, claiming the killer must be a Jewish ritual slaughterman, possessing both the anatomical knowledge and the blades required. These theories spread despite their lack of foundation, feeding prejudices that already existed within portions of the English population. On the 10th of September, police arrested a man named John Pizer, a bootmaker known locally as Leather Apron, based on witness reports that he had been seen threatening prostitutes in the area. He was held for several days while his alibi was verified, ultimately being released when it was established he had been nowhere near Hanbury Street on the morning of the murder. But the arrest was widely reported, the newspapers publishing his name and description, effectively destroying whatever reputation he maintained in the community. Annie Chapman was buried on the 14th of September. Her funeral attended by crowds of curious onlookers who lined the route to the cemetery. The newspapers published engravings purporting to show her likeness, though most bore little resemblance to the actual woman. She became, like Mary Ann Nichols before her, a symbol of poverty, of the dangers facing women on the streets, of the failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. The investigation continued without success. The detectives interviewed hundreds of individuals, compiled vast files of statements and reports, pursued leads that led nowhere. The mark on the fence was removed to the police station for safekeeping, where it was examined by various experts who could offer no explanation for its meaning. Some suggested it was a symbol from occult practice. Others thought it might be a tradesman's mark, left inadvertently. A few proposed it was meaningless, the random product of a disordered mind. Inspector Abberline, reviewing the evidence late into the night, understood they were facing something unprecedented. The level of violence, the surgical precision, the time taken at the scene, the leaving of a distinctive mark, these elements combined to suggest a killer who was not simply mad or vicious, but who had some larger purpose in mind. Whether that purpose was comprehensible to normal minds remained uncertain. The city held its breath, waiting. The newspapers published daily updates, theories, wild speculation. The streets of Whitechapel emptied earlier each night, women choosing the workhouse over the risk of earning their DOS money. The police maintained their heightened presence. Constables walking beats in pairs, watching every shadow, questioning anyone abroad during the dangerous hours before dawn. And somewhere in London's vast sprawl, the artist considered his work. 2 canvases completed, 2 inkblots rendered. The gallery was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Science of Blood. The Metropolitan Police maintained a criminal investigation department at Scotland Yard, established in 1878 to provide centralised detective services for crimes requiring specialised investigation. The department occupied offices in the Norman Shaw building on Victoria Embankment, where files accumulated in cabinets and detectives worked at desks piled with papers and reports. Here, in rooms lit by gas and warmed inadequately by coal fires, the machinery of investigation ground forward through methods that had changed little in decades. The science available to Victorian police was limited in scope and reliability. Photography existed, but required long exposure times and adequate lighting, making crime scene documentation difficult under the best circumstances and nearly impossible in the dark courts and alleys where murders occurred. Fingerprint identification remained unknown to British police in 1888, though research was being conducted in India on the uniqueness of finger patterns. Blood typing would not be discovered for another dozen years. The microscope had been applied to criminal investigation in some European jurisdictions, but British police lacked both the equipment and the trained personnel to make use of such technology. What the police possessed instead was organisation, procedure, and accumulated experience. They maintained files on known criminals, recording physical descriptions, methods of operation, associates, and previous convictions. They collected information from informants, paid modest sums to those willing to provide intelligence about criminal activities. They relied on confession as the primary means of securing conviction, knowing that physical evidence alone was rarely sufficient to prove guilt in court. Dr. George Bagster Phillips had served as divisional police surgeon for H Division since 1865. He was 62 years old, trained at the Middlesex Hospital, experienced in the examination of bodies found in violent circumstances. His duties included attending crime scenes, conducting post-mortem examinations, and providing expert testimony at inquests and trials. He worked from a surgery on Spital Square, maintaining a private practice while fulfilling his obligations to the Metropolitan Police. The examination of Annie Chapman's body took place in the mortuary at Whitechapel Workhouse on the afternoon of September 8th. Dr. Phillips worked methodically, recording each injury, measuring depths and angles, noting the sequence in which wounds had been inflicted. The body lay on a plain wooden table in a room designed for functionality rather than comfort, the walls whitewashed, the floor concrete, the light provided by windows set high in the walls. The throat wounds had been delivered from left to right, suggesting a right-handed attacker facing the victim. The blade had cut through skin, muscle, and cartilage with sufficient force to nearly decapitate the victim. Death would have occurred within seconds. Blood loss producing unconsciousness almost immediately. The abdominal wounds had been inflicted after death, the absence of vital reaction indicating the heart had ceased beating before these injuries were made. The removal of organs demonstrated both knowledge and purpose. The uterus and portions of the bladder had been taken from the body, excised cleanly despite the poor lighting conditions that must have prevailed during the attack. Dr. Phillips estimated this work would have required at least 5 minutes, possibly longer, even for someone familiar with anatomy. The precision of the cuts suggested medical training or extensive experience with dissection. Inspector Abberline attended the post-mortem examination, standing at the periphery of the room while Dr. Phillips worked. He had witnessed many such examinations over his career, but these murders presented something beyond the usual violence of the East End. The combination of savage throat wounds and careful anatomical work suggested a mind that could shift between rage and methodical precision, between destruction and something that resembled scientific inquiry. The question of motive occupied much of the discussion among investigating officers. Murder for profit was understood. Robbery, inheritance, insurance fraud. Murder in passion was familiar, domestic violence, jealousy, revenge. But murder that involved the careful excision of organs, the arrangement of bodies, the drawing of symmetrical patterns in blood, this suggested motives that lay outside normal criminal psychology. Some detectives theorized the killer sought organs for medical purposes, that a market existed for anatomical specimens that could not be obtained through legal channels. Dr. Phillips dismissed this notion, pointing out that organs removed under such crude conditions would be useless for medical study or teaching. Others suggested the murders were the work of someone acting under religious delusion, performing some twisted form of ritual sacrifice. The rabbis consulted by police stated firmly that nothing in Jewish law or practice involved human sacrifice or the taking of organs, that such suggestions were offensive and dangerous given the current atmosphere of suspicion toward the Jewish community. The Inkblot patterns received particular attention. Specialists in various fields were consulted, shown photographs and sketches of the marks found at both crime scenes. An expert in ancient languages examined them, seeking resemblance to alphabets or symbolic systems, finding none. A professor of botany suggested they might represent plant structures, the branching of roots or the venation of leaves, but could offer no explanation for why a murderer would draw such things. An artist consulted by the Scotland Yard noted that the symmetry suggested familiarity with techniques of composition and balance, that whoever created these marks possessed some understanding of visual design. The Anthropometric Office at Scotland Yard, recently established based on methods developed by Alphonse Bertillon in Paris, maintained records of criminal measurements and descriptions. The theory held that no two individuals possessed identical physical measurements, That precise recording of dimensions could provide a scientific basis for identification. Officers were trained in the proper technique for measuring head length, arm span, foot size, and various other bodily proportions, but such methods required having a suspect to measure, and the Whitechapel investigation had produced no viable suspects despite the hundreds of men questioned. The only physical evidence available consisted of the marks themselves, preserved through photography and sketches, and the weapons presumed used. Dr. Phillips believed the throat wounds had been inflicted with a different instrument than the abdominal work, perhaps a straight razor for the throat and a surgical knife for the more precise cuts. But no bloody knives had been found, no weapons discarded near the crime scenes. The killer either carried his instruments away with him, or disposed of them in ways that prevented discovery. Blood evidence provided little assistance given the limitations of Victorian forensic science. The marks on the walls and fence were clearly human blood, the victim's own blood used as medium for the patterns, but there was no method to determine if blood found elsewhere might belong to the victims or the killer, no way to distinguish one person's blood from another's. Clothing stained with blood could indicate guilt or could simply reflect the occupation of a butcher or slaughterhouse worker or medical student. The investigation generated paperwork in quantities that threatened to overwhelm the available filing systems. Each detective submitted daily reports. Each interview was transcribed and filed. Telegrams flew between divisions and between Scotland Yard and local stations. The Commissioner of Police received daily summaries of progress, such as it was. The Home Secretary demanded updates, asking why the police had failed to apprehend the killer, despite the resources deployed. Inspector Abberline worked from early morning until late at night, reviewing statements, pursuing leads, coordinating the efforts of detectives spread across the East End. He had requested assistance from the City of London Police, whose jurisdiction bordered Whitechapel to the west, asking that they watch for the suspicious individuals or activity that might indicate the killer had moved into their territory. He had contacted police in other cities inquiring whether similar murders had occurred elsewhere in recent years. The responses provided no useful intelligence. A few cases of murdered prostitutes were reported from various locations, but none displayed the distinctive features of the Whitechapel murders, the anatomical mutilation, the time and care taken at the scene, the leaving of symmetrical marks in blood. If the killer had practiced his methods elsewhere, he had done so without drawing official attention. The newspapers, meanwhile, published their own theories with confidence that far exceeded the evidence. Medical men wrote letters to editors, offering opinions about the killer's possible profession or training. Spiritualists claimed to have communicated with the victim's spirits, who provided descriptions of their murderer that conflicted with each other and with known facts. Amateur detectives presented elaborate theories involving secret societies, foreign agents, and vengeful madmen escaped from asylums. The pressure on police mounted daily. Editorials condemned the failure to make arrests, questioned the competence of investigating officers, demanded that the Home Secretary replace the Commissioner with someone more capable. Public meetings were held in Whitechapel, crowds gathering to hear speakers denounce the police and demand better protection for residents. The Jewish community organised its own meetings, attempting to counter the growing anti-Semitic rhetoric that blamed immigrants for the murders. Dr. Thomas Bond, consulting surgeon to A Division and lecturer on forensic medicine, was asked to review the medical evidence from both murders. He examined the bodies, read Dr. Phillips' reports, and studied the photographs and sketches of the crime scenes. His conclusions largely confirmed what was already known. The killer possessed anatomical knowledge, worked with deliberation rather than frenzy, and demonstrated escalating confidence between the first and second murders. But Dr. Bond added an observation that would prove significant. He noted that the injuries inflicted served no practical purpose if the motive was simply to kill. The throat wounds alone would have caused death within seconds. The subsequent mutilation must therefore serve some other purpose, perhaps sexual gratification, though he hesitated to speculate on such matters in official reports, or perhaps the fulfillment of some compulsion that existed only in the killer's mind. The concept of compulsion in murder was not unknown to Victorian medicine. but it remained poorly understood. Alienists, physicians specializing in mental disease, recognized that some individuals acted under irresistible impulses, driven by delusions or perverse desires. But the relationship between such compulsions and criminal behavior remained a matter of debate. Some argued that true madness precluded criminal responsibility, that those acting under delusion could not be held accountable for actions they could not control. Others maintained that crime was crime regardless of the perpetrator's mental state, that protection of society required punishment of dangerous individuals, whether mad or sane. Inspector Abberline did not much concern himself with such philosophical questions. His task was to identify and apprehend the killer, not to understand the workings of a diseased mind. But he recognized that conventional investigative methods were proving inadequate. The killer left no witnesses, no evidence beyond the bodies themselves and the marks drawn in blood. He selected victims from a population that moved constantly through the streets, that had no fixed addresses, that might be present one night and gone the next. He struck in darkness, in areas where screams went unremarked, and blood in the streets was not unusual, where the police could not maintain constant surveillance even with increased patrols. The science of blood, such as it was in 1888, could tell investigators how a person had died, could estimate time of death within a range of several hours, could identify major organs and describe injuries in precise anatomical terms, but it could not identify who had wielded the knife, could not distinguish the killer's blood from that of his victims, could not read in the patterns left on walls anything more than what was visible to the naked eye. 2 murders in 8 days, 2 women dead, their bodies violated in ways that suggested purpose beyond simple violence. 2 inkblots drawn with care while blood was still liquid enough to flow, symmetrical patterns that must have required light to execute properly. And despite all the resources of the Metropolitan Police, despite the expertise of doctors and the investigation of detectives, despite the public outcry and political pressure, no arrest, no suspect, no progress toward understanding who walked the streets of Whitechapel with knife and lamp, creating art from human suffering. The files accumulated, the theories multiplied. The science available to Victorian investigators proved inadequate to the task. And as September advanced toward autumn's deepest darkness, the police could do little but maintain their patrols, interview more witnesses who had seen nothing useful, and wait for the killer to make some error that would finally provide the evidence needed for arrest. The wait would not be long, but when the next murders came, they would demonstrate that the killer's confidence had grown beyond what any investigator had imagined possible. Chapter 6: The Third Symmetry. The evening of the 30th of September began as most evenings did in the autumn of 1888. The gas lamps were lit as darkness fell, casting their yellow glow over streets where traffic thinned but never ceased entirely. The public houses filled with workers spending their wages, voices rising in argument or song as the gin flowed freely. Women took their positions on familiar corners, negotiating with men who emerged from the shadows with coins in their pockets and purposes they preferred to keep private. Elizabeth Stride had spent the early evening in the Queen's Head public house on Commercial Street. She was 44 years old, born in Sweden, long resident in London, known to those who associated with her as Long Liz. She had told various stories about her past, that she was the widow of a ship's carpenter who had drowned in the Princess Alice disaster, that she had survived the sinking herself. Neither story was true, but the lies were harmless, providing a history more respectable than the reality of prostitution and lodging-house existence. She left the Queen's Head around 11 o'clock, walking south on Commercial Street toward Berner Street. Several witnesses would later remember seeing her in various locations, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of a man. The descriptions of this man varied sufficiently that investigators could never be certain whether witnesses had seen the same individual or several different men. Such was the nature of witness testimony in districts where gaslight was poor and attention was rarely paid to ordinary encounters between prostitutes and customers. Berner Street ran east from Commercial Street, a narrow lane lined with tenements and small warehouses. The International Working Men's Educational Club occupied numbers 40 and 42. a socialist organisation that provided meeting space and social activities for Jewish immigrants. On this night here, a debate and social gathering had been held, concluding around midnight, with approximately 30 members remaining in the club's upstairs rooms, singing Russian songs. Dutfield's yard opened off Berner Street through a pair of wooden gates, providing access to a courtyard surrounded by buildings used for light manufacturing and storage. At 10 minutes to 1 in the morning, Louis Diemschutz drove his pony cart through the gates, returning from a day spent selling cheap jewellery at market. The pony shied to the left, refusing to proceed straight into the yard. Diemschutz, puzzled by this behaviour, climbed down and struck a match to see what might be blocking the way. Elizabeth Stride lay on her left side, her body parallel to the wall of the club building, her feet toward the street. Blood flowed from a wound in her throat, still liquid, pooling on the cobblestones and soaking into the packed earth at the edge of the paving. Diemschutz ran into the club shouting for help, and several members rushed down to the yard. Someone ran for police while others searched the surrounding area, checking the privy and the buildings, finding nothing. Police Constable Henry Lamb arrived within minutes, followed shortly by Dr. Frederick Blackwell, whose surgery stood nearby on Commercial Road. The doctor examined the body by the lamplight, noting that blood still flowed from the throat wound, indicating death had occurred very recently, perhaps within the last 10 to 15 minutes. The single cut to the throat had been delivered from left to right with sufficient force to sever the windpipe but not the major blood vessels of the neck, but there was no abdominal mutilation. No organs had been removed. The woman's clothing, though disturbed and had not been pulled up around her waist, and crucially, no mark had been drawn on the wall or gates nearby. The body lay undisturbed except for the single fatal wound, suggesting the killer had been interrupted before he could complete his usual work. The theory formed immediately that Diemschutz's arrival had interrupted the murder, that the killer had fled into the darkness mere moments before the cart entered the yard. Constables searched the surrounding streets but found no one covered in blood, no one acting suspiciously. The members of the club were questioned extensively, their names recorded, their alibis verified. The investigation focused on Berner Street and Dutfield's yard, collecting witness statements, documenting the crime scene, attempting to establish a timeline that might reveal who had been present at the crucial moments. At 1:45 in the morning, while police were still securing the scene in Dutfield's yard, a different report came through to City of London Police Headquarters. A woman's body had been found in Mitre Square, just across the boundary between Metropolitan Police jurisdiction and the city's territory. The location was less than half a mile from Berner Street, a 15-minute walk through streets that were neither particularly busy nor completely deserted at that hour. Police Constable Edward Watkins had walked through Mitre Square at 1:30, following his regular beat, finding nothing unusual. The square was small, surrounded by warehouses and a few houses, lit by a single gas lamp. When he returned at 1:45, he found a woman's body lying in the southwest corner of the square, positioned against the wall of an empty house. The mutilation was extensive. The throat had been cut deeply, the face slashed with cuts that destroyed recognizable features. The abdomen had been opened completely, intestines pulled out and draped over the right shoulder. The uterus and left kidney had been removed from the body and were not present at the scene. The liver had been penetrated by a knife thrust. The cuts were deep, violent, executed with what appeared to be furious speed. On the wall above the body, drawn in blood that was already beginning to dry in the cool night air, was an inkblot. This third pattern was the largest yet, perhaps 18 inches across, elaborate in its symmetry, resembling some fantastic creature with spreading limbs or the branching of a great tree. The pattern had been drawn quickly, judging by the drips and runs in the blood, but the symmetry remained perfect, each side mirroring the other, with precision that spoke to design rather than accident. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, City Police Surgeon, arrived at the scene before 3 o'clock. He examined the body by lamplight, noting that death could not have occurred more than 30 minutes before discovery, that the killer must have worked with extraordinary speed to inflict such extensive injuries in the short time available between police patrols. The removal of organs had been done roughly but effectively, suggesting anatomical knowledge combined with haste. The timing was unmistakable. 2 murders, 45 minutes apart, half a mile distant from each other. The killer had been interrupted at Berner Street, had fled before completing his work, and had immediately sought another victim, finding Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square and inflicting upon her the violence he'd been prevented from completing on Elizabeth Stride. Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old, a woman who'd spent time in workhouses and casual wards, who earned money occasionally through hawking and prostitution. She had been released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 o'clock that morning, having been held since 8:30 the previous evening for being drunk and incapable. The station sergeant had judged her sober enough to leave, and she had walked out into the subsequent of the night, heading in the direction of Mitre Square. Within 45 minutes she was dead, her body left in a corner where it would be discovered by the next police patrol. Inspector Abberline, summoned from his home in the early morning hours, travelled between the 2 crime scenes, reviewing evidence at Berner Street before proceeding to Mitre Square. The pattern was clear: single killer, 2 victims, methodical progression from interrupted murder to completed work. The geographical knowledge displayed was sophisticated, requiring familiarity with police patrol routes, understanding of how to move between jurisdictions, knowledge of which streets and squares offered concealment and which were too exposed for his purposes. The coordination required between Metropolitan Police and City of London Police presented immediate challenges. The 2 forces operated under different command structures, maintained separate files, followed different procedures. Inspector James McWilliam of City Police took charge of the Mitre Square investigation, while Inspector Abberline focused on Berner Street. But clearly the murders were connected and required unified approach. The search for evidence produced one significant find. At 2:30 in the morning, a constable patrolling Goulston Street, approximately 1/3 of a mile from Mitre Square, found a piece of bloodied apron in a doorway. The fabric was identified as having come from Catherine Eddowes' apron, cut or torn from her body and carried away from the murder scene. Above where the apron piece lay, written in chalk on the black dado of the wall, was a message. The exact wording of this message became subject to dispute, as officers recorded different versions. The most reliable account suggested it read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The double negative made the meaning ambiguous. Did it accuse or defend Jews? Inspector McWilliam wanted the message photographed immediately, but the light was poor and photography at night remained technically unreliable. Sir Charles Warren, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, arrived at the scene before dawn and ordered the writing erased before it could be photographed, fearing it would inflame anti-Jewish sentiment when the area's residents awoke and saw it. This decision would be heavily criticised in subsequent years, destroying potential evidence for reasons that seemed more political than investigative. But in the moment, with tensions high and fears of anti-Jewish riots very real, Warren judged that preventing immediate violence outweighed the preservation of evidence whose meaning was unclear. The double murder created panic that exceeded anything the previous killings had generated. The newspapers published special editions, the headlines growing larger with each printing. The killer had demonstrated he could strike twice in a single night, could evade police patrols in 2 different jurisdictions, could work with such speed that even interruption did not prevent him from completing his purpose. The streets of Whitechapel and the surrounding districts emptied as darkness fell. Women refused to go out alone. The vigilance committees expanded their patrols, armed citizens walking the streets with clubs and lanterns, creating their own alternative to police protection. The investigation intensified to a degree that strained available resources. Detectives worked through the night and into the following days, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, pursuing every lead regardless of how unlikely. The Home Secretary demanded daily briefings, the Commissioner faced calls for his resignation. The newspapers published letters from citizens offering theories, demanding action, questioning why the most sophisticated police force in the world could not apprehend a single killer. Dr. Brown's post-mortem examination of Catherine Eddowes revealed details that would haunt the investigators. The kidney had been removed cleanly despite the poor lighting and time pressure, indicating the killer knew exactly where to cut and what he sought. The facial mutilations served no purpose except perhaps to prevent identification, though the body was identified through clothing and the fact that she had been released from police custody shortly before her death. Elizabeth Stride's examination showed only the throat wound, supporting the theory of interruption. Had Louis Demschutz arrived 5 minutes later, investigators believed, Stride's body would have displayed the same extensive mutilation as Eddowes. The timing of that interruption had been extraordinarily precise, early enough to prevent the additional violence, late enough that the killer had already begun his work. The 3 inkblots, for investigators counted only those in Bucks Row, Hanbury Street and Mitre Square, excluding Berner Street where the killer had been interrupted, were studied extensively. Specialists examined the photographs and sketches, searching for meaning in the patterns. Some suggested they were maps, representations of streets or territories. Others thought they might be signatures, the killer's method of claiming responsibility for his work. A few proposed they were meaningless, the product of insanity expressing itself in visual form. But most investigators, including Inspector Abberline, believed the marks were deliberate, that they served a purpose known to the killer, even if incomprehensible to observers. The progression from smaller to larger, from simpler to more elaborate, suggested development of technique, increasing confidence, evolution of whatever message the killer intended to convey. 3 murders had become 5. 5 women dead over the course of a month, their bodies left in the streets, their blood used to create art of a sort, their deaths generating fear and outrage that spread far beyond the East End. The investigation had consumed vast resources, generated thousands of pages of documentation, subjected hundreds of men to questioning, yet had produced not a single viable suspect, not a single piece of evidence that pointed clearly toward any individual. The city waited in dread for what would come next, knowing that the killer had proven himself capable of striking anywhere, at any time, with speed and skill that made detection nearly impossible. The symmetry of his work, the precision of his patterns, the careful selection of victims, all suggested a mind that operated according to logic incomprehensible to normal reason. The third symmetry had been completed. The canvas had expanded. And somewhere in London's darkness, the artist prepared for his masterwork. Chapter 7. The Watchers and the Watched. The fear that settled over Whitechapel after the double murder was qualitatively different from what had come before. Previous murders had generated concern and some degree of alarm, but the events of September 30th demonstrated that the killer operated with capabilities that exceeded what any previous criminal had displayed. The ability to strike twice in one night, to evade police patrols, to work with sufficient speed that even interruption did not prevent the completion of murder, these revelations transformed anxiety into something approaching terror. The streets emptied after dark in ways that police had never seen before. Women who had walked freely at all hours now refused to venture out after nightfall. The lodging houses, which typically turned out any resident lacking payment, began extending credit or allowing women to sleep in the common rooms rather than force them onto the streets. The workhouse casual wards filled beyond capacity, women preferring the humiliation of institutional charity to the risk of earning their 4p in the usual manner. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee had formed shortly after Annie Chapman's murder, consisting of local tradesmen and residents who believed the police were failing in their duty to protect the district. George Lusk, a builder and vestryman, served as chairman, organising volunteers to patrol the streets in groups of 4 or 5, carrying lanterns and stout sticks, watching for suspicious activity. By early October, the committee had enrolled several hundred members, dividing Whitechapel into sections and maintaining nightly patrols from dusk until dawn. The relationship between these volunteer patrols and the Metropolitan Police was complicated. Some police officers welcomed the additional eyes on the streets, recognising that More watchers increased the likelihood of observing something useful. Others resented the implication that police were inadequate, viewing the vigilance committees as interference with professional law enforcement. Several confrontations occurred when patrols encountered each other in the darkness, each side uncertain whether the other represented legitimate authority or potential threat. The committee offered a reward of £50 for information leading to the killer's arrest, funds raised through public subscription. This was a substantial sum, representing perhaps 6 months' wages for a working man, and it generated a flood of tips and accusations. Men reported their neighbours for suspicious behaviour. Women claimed their husbands or lodgers had come home with blood on their clothing. The committee investigated each report, interviewing accusers and accused, passing credible information to police while dismissing obvious fabrications or personal grudges, masquerading as useful intelligence. The Jewish community organised its own response to the mounting tension. The Board of Deputies of British Jews issued statements condemning the murders and offering cooperation with police investigations. Synagogues held special services, rabbis preaching that the community must demonstrate through action its abhorrence of violence and its commitment to justice. Funds were raised to assist police efforts, though Scotland Yard refused monetary contributions, wary of accusations that justice could be bought or that investigations might be influenced by those providing financial support. But these formal responses could not prevent the spread of anti-Semitic sentiment that grew in proportion to public fear. The leather apron found at Hanbury Street, the anatomical knowledge suggested by the organ removals, the message written on the wall in Goulston Street, all of these elements fed theories that the killer must be Jewish, that the murders represented some perverse ritual or revenge plot. Anonymous pamphlets appeared, circulating through public houses and market stalls, claiming that Jews were responsible for all manner of crimes and social ills. Several incidents escalated toward violence. A Jewish peddler was chased through the streets by a crowd convinced he was the killer, based solely on his appearance and accent. A synagogue was vandalized, windows broken and threatening messages painted on the walls. The police increased their presence in areas with large Jewish populations, attempting to prevent riots, while simultaneously investigating whether the killer might indeed be found within the immigrant community. Inspector Abberline, whose years in Whitechapel had given him extensive contacts within all segments of the community, worked to counter the worst of the prejudice while pursuing legitimate lines of investigation. He interviewed dozens of Jewish men who had been accused by neighbours or reported by anonymous letters. He consulted with rabbis and community leaders, seeking their assistance in identifying anyone whose behaviour might warrant scrutiny. He reviewed the files on Jewish criminals, of which there were many: thieves, receivers of stolen goods, men convicted of assault or fraud, but none whose history suggested the capacity for murder of the type being committed. The watching went in multiple directions. The vigilance committees watched the streets. The police watched both the streets and the vigilance committees, concerned that mob justice might lead to the lynching of an innocent man. The residents of Whitechapel watched each other, suspicion falling on anyone who behaved oddly or who fit whatever image people had formed of what a murderer should look like. The watched, meanwhile, existed in a state of constant evaluation. Men found themselves subjected to questions about their whereabouts on the nights of the murders. Butchers and slaughtermen received particular attention, their knives examined, their routines scrutinised. Doctors and medical students faced suspicion based on the theory that anatomical knowledge must indicate professional training. Sailors were questioned whenever ships docked, the police reasoning that someone who appeared periodically and then vanished might be a seaman whose schedule aligned with the murders. The sheer number of suspects investigated during October and November of 1888 exceeded anything in the Metropolitan Police's prior experience. Every division maintained files of men who had been interviewed, their statements recorded, their alibis checked. Some were questioned multiple times as new information emerged, or as witnesses reported seeing them in suspicious circumstances. The process consumed vast amounts of detective time, producing mountains of paperwork but few actionable leads. Several suspects received extended attention. Severin Klusowski, a Polish barber also known as George Chapman, worked in the area and possessed some medical knowledge. He was interviewed extensively, his movements on the relevant nights examined, but no evidence connected him to any of the murders. John Pizer, the leather worker arrested shortly after Annie Chapman's death, remained under periodic surveillance despite his alibis being confirmed. Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born confidence trickster with a history of theft and fraud, was sought by police but proved to be incarcerated during the period of the murders. The newspapers published descriptions of suspicious men seen near the crime scenes, based on witness accounts that varied so widely as to be nearly useless for identification purposes. Some witnesses described a man of medium height with a dark moustache. Others reported a tall man, clean-shaven, well-dressed. A few claimed to have seen a man in bloodied clothing, though none had thought to alert police at the time. The descriptions accumulated in police files, each contradicting the others, creating a composite of possible suspects that encompassed half the male population of London. The pressure on police intensified daily. Questions were asked in Parliament. The Home Secretary defended the Metropolitan Police's efforts while acknowledging that results had been inadequate. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner, faced mounting criticism for his leadership, particularly following his decision to erase the Goulston Street message before it could be photographed. Various officials offered opinions about what should be done differently, what methods should be employed, what resources should be deployed. The use of bloodhounds was proposed and briefly attempted. 2 dogs were brought to London and tested in Regent's Park, but they proved unreliable, and the plan was abandoned after one of the dogs was lost for several hours in the park, eventually being found in a distressed state. The incident provided additional material for newspaper mockery of police competence. Rewards remained controversial. The government refused to offer official rewards, maintaining that such payments encouraged false accusations and created perverse incentives. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee's rewards stood, but it generated more noise than useful information. The committee's small staff overwhelmed by tips that ranged from the merely unlikely to the obviously delusional. The watching took its toll on the watchers as well. Constables walked their beats night after night, knowing that the killer might be observing them, timing his movements to avoid patrols, laughing at their inability to prevent his work. Some officers requested transfers out of H Division, unwilling to continue serving in a district where failure was so public and criticism so relentless. Others threw themselves into the work with increased determination, volunteering for extra shifts, pursuing leads on their own time, driven by professional pride or personal conviction that they might be the one to make the breakthrough that had eluded everyone else. Inspector Abberline worked 18-hour days reviewing files, coordinating investigations, travelling between crime scenes and police stations, meeting with officials who demanded progress reports. He slept in his office more often than in his own bed, surviving on tea and whatever food other officers brought him. The strain showed in his face, in the weight he lost, in the shortness of his temper when dealing with reporters or civilians who offered unsolicited theories about how the investigation should be conducted. The professional detectives were not alone in their obsession. Amateur investigators appeared, gentlemen with time and money who fancied themselves capable of succeeding where the police had failed. They walked the streets with notebooks, recording observations, interviewing prostitutes and lodging house keepers, compiling their own theories which they then presented to newspapers or police with absolute confidence in their correctness. Some of these amateur efforts were harmless, even occasionally useful. Others interfered with official investigations, contaminating crime scenes, or frightening potential witnesses with aggressive questioning. The socialist clubs and political organisations in the East End held meetings, debating whether the murders were the product of capitalism's dehumanisation of the poor, whether society's indifference to the suffering of women in poverty had created conditions that allowed such crimes to occur. Speeches were delivered, pamphlets distributed, arguments conducted in meeting halls and public houses about root causes and systematic solutions. The murders became woven into larger debates about poverty, immigration, the role of government, the responsibilities of the wealthy toward the poor. Through all of this, the women of Whitechapel continued their lives as best they could. Those with no alternatives still walked the streets, still negotiated with men in doorways, still led customers into courtyards and passages, where privacy could be found for a few minutes. They took precautions, travelling in pairs when possible, avoiding the darkest courts, paying attention to anything unusual in a customer's behaviour or appearance. But 4p for a bed remained 4p for a bed, and the economics of survival left little room for excessive caution. The watching and the being watched created an atmosphere of paranoia that penetrated every level of society in the East End. Trust eroded, neighbour suspected neighbour. Every unfamiliar face drew scrutiny. Men who had lived in the district for years found themselves subjected to questions about their movements, their occupations, their histories. The fabric of community, already strained by poverty and overcrowding, began to tear under the weight of fear and suspicion. October advanced toward November, the days growing shorter, the nights longer and darker. The fog returned, thick and persistent, reducing visibility and dampening sound, creating perfect conditions for crime. The police maintained their increased patrols. The vigilance committees continued their nightly watches, and everyone waited for the next murder, knowing it would come, uncertain only of when and where. The watchers watched. The watcher tried to remain invisible, and somewhere in the darkness the killer moved freely, confident in his ability to evade detection, preparing for the final demonstration of his skill. The symmetry he had created in blood would soon reach its culmination in a killing so elaborate and shocking that it would haunt investigators for generations, becoming the touchstone against which all subsequent horrors would be measured. Chapter 8. The Lord Mayor's Mayor's Night. The 9th of November 1888 fell on a Friday. London prepared for the annual Lord Mayor's Show, a pageant that would process through the streets on the following day, celebrating the installation of the new Lord Mayor with elaborate floats and ceremonial displays. The spectacle drew crowds from across the city, a moment of civic celebration that briefly united all classes in the shared experience of witnessing tradition enacted in public space. In Whitechapel, the approaching festivities meant little. The district existed at a remove from such ceremonies, the poverty of its residents creating a barrier as effective as any geographical boundary. Life continued according to its usual patterns. The markets operated, the workshops produced their goods, the public houses dispensed their gin, and the women walked the streets seeking customers who would provide the coins needed for another night's survival. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old, younger than the previous victims, and by the accounts of those who knew her, more attractive. She had lived in London for several years, moving through various lodging houses and rooms, supporting herself through prostitution. In recent months she had occupied a small room at 13 Miller's Court, a narrow passage accessible through an archway between 26 and 27 Dorset Street. The room measured approximately 12 feet square, containing a bed, a table, 2 chairs and a fireplace. She paid 4 shillings, 6p per week in rent to John McCarthy, who owned several properties in the area, but by November she'd fallen weeks behind in payment. The room's single window faced the court, providing limited light even during the daytime hours. The door opened directly onto the narrow passage, with only a few feet separating Kelly's entrance from that of the neighbouring rooms. Privacy was minimal, conversations and activities in one room easily overheard by occupants of others. But it was private accommodation nonetheless, superior to a lodging house bed, offering space that belonged to her alone for as long as she could manage the rent. Kelly had been seen throughout the evening of November 8th, drinking in the Britannia public house, singing songs, speaking with various acquaintances. She returned to Miller's Court around midnight, according to some witnesses, though others reported seeing her on the streets as late as 2 o'clock in the morning. The inconsistencies in witness accounts would never be fully resolved. The darkness and the gin creating conditions where memory became unreliable and time lost its precision. At 11:15 on the morning of November 9th, Thomas Bowyer, employed by John McCarthy to collect rents, knocked at Kelly's door to request payment. Receiving no answer, he walked around to the window, facing the court. The window had been broken previously, a piece of muslin serving as inadequate covering. Bowyer reached through the broken pane, pulled aside the muslin and looked into the room. What he saw sent him running back to McCarthy's shop on Dorset Street, stammering words that made little coherent sense. McCarthy accompanied him back to Miller's Court to look through the window himself, then immediately sent Bowyer to Commercial Street Police Station to fetch officers. Inspector Walter Beck arrived within minutes, viewed the scene through the window, and sent for Inspector Abberline and Dr. Phillips, while ordering that the door remain closed until senior officers arrived to take charge of the investigation. The delay that followed was unusual. Police procedure typically required immediate entry to secure crime scenes and preserve evidence. But Inspector Beck, having glimpsed what lay within the room, made the decision to wait for more experienced officers before proceeding. Perhaps he recognized that this murder differed in scale from what had come before, that it required the attention of those most familiar with the case. Perhaps he simply wished to avoid bearing sole responsibility for what needed to be done. Inspector Abberline arrived shortly before 1:30, accompanied by Superintendent Thomas Arnold. Dr. Phillips came separately, bringing his medical bag and the grim experience of having examined 4 previous victims. The door to Kelly's room had a spring lock that had engaged when closed, and no key could be found. McCarthy forced the lock with a pickaxe, and the door swung inward to reveal the full extent of what the killer had accomplished. The body on the bed had been so extensively mutilated, identification was initially uncertain. The face had been destroyed, cut away entirely, rendering the features unrecognizable. The throat had been severed down to the spinal column. The entire abdomen and thighs had been emptied of organs, which had been removed and placed around the body with what appeared to be deliberate arrangement. The breasts had been cut off and positioned on the table. The heart had been taken from the chest cavity and was not present in the room, but it was the walls that captured the most horrified attention. The killer had used Kelly's blood to create his most elaborate work yet. The Inkblot patterns covered the walls on 3 sides of the room, each different, each perfectly symmetrical, some measuring 2 feet across. The patterns showed sophistication beyond what had appeared at previous scenes, elaborate branching structures, mandala-like designs, shapes that resembled both organic growth and geometric precision. The blood had been applied with enough care that individual brushstrokes or finger marks were visible in places, suggesting the killer had worked methodically, taking time to achieve the visual effects he desired. The room showed signs of sustained activity. The fire in the grate had burned intensely, consuming what appeared to be clothing and perhaps other materials, providing light by which the killer could work. Partially melted candle wax pooled on the table, indicating multiple candles had burned for extended periods. The disorder suggested hours of work, the killer taking apart Kelly's body with a thoroughness that went far beyond what had been done to previous victims. Dr. Phillips conducted his examination in the room itself, the body being too fragile for immediate removal. He worked through the afternoon, documenting each injury, attempting to determine sequence and method. The number of cuts exceeded 200. The disarticulation of limbs and removal of organs suggested someone who had moved beyond mere knowledge of anatomy into something approaching obsessive interest in the body's internal structure. Several organs were positioned in ways that seemed intentionally arranged, as though the killer had been creating a display or conducting some form of investigation. The estimated time of death created immediate problems for the investigation. Witnesses reported hearing cries of "murder" from the vicinity of Miller's Court around 3:45 in the morning, but such cries were common enough in Whitechapel that no one had investigated. Other witnesses claimed to have seen Kelly alive and on the streets much later, as late as 8 or 9 in the morning. The medical evidence suggested death had occurred many hours before the body's discovery, perhaps in the early morning hours, but determining precise timing was complicated by the extensive mutilation and the fire that had burned in the room, altering temperature and affecting the usual markers of post-mortem change. The investigation of Miller's Court continued into the evening. Every room in the court was searched, every resident interviewed. The entry passage was examined for bloodstains or other evidence. The privy was inspected. Constables searched the surrounding area, checking privies and drains, looking for discarded organs or bloody clothing. Nothing was found beyond what lay within Kelly's room. The lock on the door suggested the killer had either possessed a key or had locked the door from inside and departed through the window. Though the window was small and departure that way would have been difficult, the spring lock mechanism could be activated from inside simply by closing the door, allowing the killer to secure the room behind him if he had left through the door in the normal manner. But if he possessed a key, where had he obtained it? Kelly had lost her key some weeks previously and had been reaching through the broken window to work the lock from inside when she needed entry. The removal of the heart generated particular speculation. Unlike previous organ removals, which had some precedent in anatomical study or body-snatching history, the taking of the heart seemed symbolic, suggesting motive beyond medical curiosity. Some investigators theorized about ritual significance, though no known ritual involved such acts. Others suggested the killer had taken the heart as a trophy, a souvenir of his most extensive work. The patterns on the walls received exhaustive documentation. Photographers worked through the afternoon and into the evening, using magnesium flash powder to illuminate the dark room, capturing images of the designs before the body was removed and the scene disturbed. Artists were brought in to make watercolor copies, preserving the patterns in color, since photography of the era could only render black and white. The symmetry of the designs, the variation between them, the evident time required for their creation, all of these elements suggested the killer had felt completely secure in Kelly's room, confident that he would not be interrupted or discovered. The news of Kelly's murder spread through Whitechapel within hours, then rippled outward across London. The extent of the mutilation, the time the killer had apparently spent in the room, the elaborate nature of the blood patterns, these details leaked despite police efforts to control information, spreading through rumours and whispered conversations. The newspapers published special editions, the headlines more lurid than ever, though even the most sensationalist publications hesitated to describe the full reality of what had been found in Miller's Court. The public response was immediate and intense. Crowds gathered at the entrance to Miller's Court, held back by police cordons, straining to see into the passage where the murder had occurred. Women in the area refused to sleep alone, cramming into rooms with friends, or sitting up through the night in groups, unwilling to trust that closed doors would provide protection. The vigilance committees doubled their patrols, men walking the streets in larger groups, carrying weapons despite police warnings against taking the law into their own hands. The political ramifications intensified. Questions in Parliament became demands for action. The Home Secretary faced calls to dismiss the Commissioner of Police. Editorial writers condemned the failure of law enforcement to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Social reformers pointed to Kelly's murder as evidence that society itself bore responsibility, that poverty and desperation created conditions in which such horrors became possible. Inspector Abberline worked through the night and into the following day, coordinating the investigation, reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses. The scale of what had been done in Miller's Court suggested escalation beyond what anyone had anticipated. The previous murders had been brutal but relatively quick, completed in minutes despite the mutilation inflicted. Kelly's murder had taken hours, the killer working with a thoroughness that indicated either complete confidence in his security or a compulsion so strong that he could not stop himself, even when rational calculation suggested he should flee. The Lord Mayor's show proceeded on November the 10th as scheduled, the pageantry and celebration continuing despite the horror discovered the previous day. The contrast was jarring, the elaborate floats and ceremonial robes, the crowds cheering and waving. The bands playing while less than 2 miles away, investigators still worked in Miller's Court, documenting the scene of the most extensive murder yet committed in London's history. Mary Jane Kelly was buried on the 19th of November, her funeral attended by enormous crowds that lined the route to the cemetery. The spectacle attracted observers from across social classes, the poor who had known her mixing with middle-class curiosity seekers who had come to witness the burial of the Ripper's final victim. Flowers covered the hearse, tributes sent by individuals and organizations, expressions of sympathy and horror at what had been done to her. The investigation continued for weeks after Kelly's death, detectives pursuing every lead, interviewing hundreds of individuals, checking and rechecking alibis and timelines. But no arrest was made. No suspect emerged who could be definitively connected to the Millers Court murder or to any of the previous killings. The files accumulated thousands of pages of statements, reports, theories, and speculation, yet the fundamental questions remained unanswered. The patterns on the walls of 13 Millers Court were eventually whitewashed over, the room cleaned and re-rented. The photographs and watercolours remained in police files, studied by investigators who searched for meaning in the symmetrical designs, finding none that satisfied. The heart that had been taken from Kelly's body was never recovered, its fate unknown, becoming one more mystery among the many that surrounded the Whitechapel murders. November progressed into December, winter settling over London with its characteristic fog and cold. The streets of Whitechapel slowly returned to something approaching normal, though the fear never entirely dissipated. Women walked the streets again by necessity, needing to earn their living regardless of risk. The police maintained their heightened presence, constables patrolling in pairs, watching for anything unusual. The vigilance committees continued their work, though with diminishing numbers as the immediate panic faded and the routine of daily survival reasserted itself. The Lord Mayor's night, as it came to be known among those who investigated the case, represented both the culmination of the killer's work and the beginning of its transformation into legend. The sheer extent of what had been done in Millers Court exceeded what most people could comprehend, the reality being so extreme that even accurate descriptions seemed like exaggeration or hysteria. The murder became a reference point, the standard against which all subsequent violence would be measured and found wanting. And in the files at Scotland Yard, in the photographs and sketches and watercolours, the inkblots remained, symmetrical patterns drawn in blood by hands that had also taken Mary Jane Kelly apart piece by piece, creating art and horror in equal measure, leaving behind questions that would persist long after everyone involved in the investigation had died and been forgotten. Chapter 9. The Letters and the Lies. The first letter arrived at the Central News Agency on the 27th of September 1888, 2 days before the double murder. It was written in red ink on lined paper, the handwriting flowing and confident, the tone mocking. The letter began "Dear Boss" and proceeded to taunt the police, claiming responsibility for the previous murders and promising more to come. It was signed Jack the Ripper, the first appearance of a name that would become synonymous with Victorian murder. The Central News Agency, which has supplied news to newspapers throughout Britain, received numerous crank letters on various subjects. The agency's staff initially filed this letter without particular attention, assuming it was another hoax inspired by newspaper coverage of the Whitechapel murders. But when the double murder occurred 2 days later, the letter's promise of additional killings suddenly seemed prescient. The agency forwarded the letter to Scotland Yard, where it arrived on the 1st of October. Inspector Abberline read the letter with deep scepticism. In his experience, murderers rarely sent letters to police or newspapers announcing their crimes. Those who did write typically did so to confess, driven by guilt or religious mania, not to boast or threaten. The tone of this letter seemed theatrical, the work of someone seeking attention rather than someone genuinely involved in the murders. But the timing was troubling. The letter had been written before the double murder, yet spoke with confidence about future killings. The letter was made public, published in newspapers on October 4th. The reaction was immediate and intense. The name Jack the Ripper captured public imagination in ways that previous descriptions, the Whitechapel murderer, the leather apron, had not. The name suggested personality, almost a kind of roguish charm, despite the horror of the crimes attributed to him. The newspapers embraced the name enthusiastically, their headlines now featuring Jack the Ripper prominently as her transforming an anonymous killer into something approaching a celebrity. More letters followed. On the 1st of October, a postcard arrived at the Central News Agency, again signed Jack the Ripper, referring to the double murder and containing details that suggested the writer might have genuine knowledge of the crimes. The handwriting appeared similar to the Dear Boss letter, though expert analysis of Victorian handwriting was an imprecise art at best. This postcard also was made public, further fueling the growing obsession with the Ripper's identity and intentions. Within days, letters claiming to be from the killer began arriving by the dozens. They came to police stations, to newspaper offices, to individual journalists and officials. They arrived in different handwritings, written in various styles, some barely literate and others grammatically sophisticated. They came from across London and from distant cities, from men claiming to be the killer and from people claiming to have information about his identity. They came written in ink, in pencil, in blood or substances meant to resemble blood. The sorting of genuine from hoax became a substantial task in itself. Detectives were assigned to review every letter, comparing handwriting, checking postmarks, analysing content for details that might indicate authentic knowledge of the crimes. Most letters could be dismissed immediately as obvious fabrications, the handwriting too crude, the details contradicting known facts, the tone inconsistent with the calculated nature of the actual murders. But some letters troubled investigators more than others. On the 16th of October, George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small cardboard box at his home. The box contained half of a human kidney preserved in spirits, along with a letter written in an irregular hand. The letter claimed the kidney had been taken from Catherine Eddowes, that the writer had fried and eaten the other half, and that it had been very nice. The letter was signed From Hell, a name that some newspapers adopted as an alternative to Jack the Ripper. Dr. Openshaw, curator of the Pathology Museum at London Hospital, examined the kidney. He determined it was human, that it was a left kidney, and that it showed signs of Bright's disease. Catherine Eddowes' remaining kidney, examined during her post-mortem, had also shown signs of Bright's disease, and her left kidney had been removed by the killer. The preservation in spirits and the degree of decomposition suggested the kidney in the box could have been removed around the time of Eddowes' murder. The implications were deeply troubling. If the kidney was genuine, if it had truly been taken from Catherine Eddowes, then the sender possessed either intimate knowledge of the crime or had actually committed it. But proving the kidney's origin was impossible with Victorian medical science. There was no method to definitively match an organ to a specific body, no way to distinguish this kidney from one that might have been obtained from a hospital or medical school, where organs were regularly preserved for teaching purposes. Inspector Abberline had the kidney examined by multiple doctors, seeking consensus on whether it could have come from Eddowes. The opinions varied. Some doctors believed the kidney showed characteristics consistent with the victim's remaining kidney and could plausibly be genuine. Others thought the preservation method and decomposition state suggested it had been stored for longer than would be consistent with removal during the murder. The uncertainty meant the kidney could be neither confirmed nor dismissed as authentic evidence. The From Hell letter was analysed extensively. The handwriting differed from the Dear Boss letter and postcard, being less controlled, more erratic. Some experts suggested this indicated a different author, that the kidney package was a separate hoax perpetrated by someone who had obtained an organ from medical sources. Others argued the different handwriting might reflect the killer's deliberate attempt to disguise his hand, or might result from the killer writing in different mental states or levels of intoxication. The flood of letters continued through October and November. Some contained sketches of Inkblot patterns, claiming these represented the killer's signature marks. The accuracy of these sketches varied. Some bore no resemblance to the actual patterns found at crime scenes, having been drawn by hoaxers who knew only that marks of some kind had been left. A few sketches showed patterns that resembled the actual inkblots, closely enough to raise questions about how the artist had obtained such accurate information. The police had deliberately withheld details about the inkblot patterns from public disclosure, revealing only that marks had been found, not their specific forms or symmetrical nature. Yet several letters included references to symmetry, to patterns that mirrored themselves, to designs drawn in blood. Either the writers possessed genuine knowledge of the crime scenes, or they had correctly guessed characteristics of the marks through chance or inference. The task of responding to and investigating letters consumed enormous resources. Each letter required logging, filing, analysis. Those that seemed potentially genuine demanded follow-up investigation, checking postmarks to determine origin cities, comparing handwriting to known samples, interviewing postal workers who might remember who had posted unusual packages. The volume overwhelmed the available staff, requiring reassignment of detectives from other investigative work to manage the correspondence. Some letters contained threats against specific individuals. The Queen received several letters claiming to be from the Ripper, requiring increased security measures. Doctors who had examined the bodies received threatening correspondence. Members of the vigilance committees were warned they would be next victims if they continued their patrols. Each threat required evaluation to determine credibility, creating additional work for an already strained investigative apparatus. The psychological impact of the letters proved significant. The taunting tone of the Dear Boss letter and similar correspondence suggested the killer enjoyed the attention, that he took pleasure in the fear and confusion he generated. This understanding transformed him in public imagination from a mere criminal into something more sinister, a monster who killed not just for some comprehensible motive, but for the satisfaction of creating terror and evading capture. The press contributed significantly to this transformation. Newspapers competed for readership by publishing the most sensational coverage, speculating wildly about the killer's identity and motives, printing every letter that arrived claiming to be from him. Editorial writers analysed the handwriting, debated the meaning of various phrases, constructed elaborate theories about the killer's psychology based on the contents of correspondence that was likely fraudulent. Some journalists went further, fabricating their own letters and then publishing them as though they had been genuine communications received from the killer. The ethical standards of Victorian journalism allowed considerable liberty in pursuit of sensational stories, and the Ripper letters provided perfect material for newspapers seeking to boost circulation. The line between reporting and creation blurred, with some letters being produced by journalists specifically to generate stories they could then cover. Inspector Abberline recognised the damage this was causing to the investigation. The authentic details of the murders became hopelessly mixed with false information spread through newspaper coverage. Witnesses began reporting that they had seen things matching details they had read in the papers, their memories contaminated by suggestion. The public's understanding of the case became distorted by myth and fabrication, making it increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction. Efforts to control the flow of information largely failed. The police could request that newspapers withhold certain details, but no legal mechanism existed to enforce such requests. The competitive nature of the newspaper industry meant that any publication that agreed to restraint would simply be undercut by rivals willing to print whatever sold copies. The result was a spiral of increasingly sensational coverage, with each newspaper trying to outdo the others in lurid speculation and dramatic revelation. By December, the number of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper exceeded 300. The task of properly analysing them had become impossible. They were filed, catalogued, and largely set aside as the investigation focused on more promising leads. Years later, when historians and researchers examined these letters, the question of authenticity would remain contested. Most experts concluded that the vast majority were hoaxes, probably including the original Dear Boss letter and postcard. But the damage had been done. The name Jack the Ripper had entered public consciousness, becoming inseparable from the Whitechapel murders. The theatrical nature of the letters had transformed a series of brutal killings into something resembling entertainment, a mystery that the public could follow like a serialized novel, complete with a villain who provided his own commentary on the action. The women who had died, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, became supporting characters in a narrative dominated by the mysterious figure who had killed them. Their lives, their struggles, their humanity became secondary to speculation about the monster who had ended those lives. The letters, whether genuine or fraudulent, had achieved the transformation of murder victims into mere plot points in a larger story centered on their killer. Inspector Abberline understood this shift and resented it deeply. He had known these women, had interviewed people who knew them, had stood over their bodies and seen what had been done to them. They were not characters in a story, but human beings who had suffered terrible deaths. The letters reduced them to abstractions, their murders becoming puzzles to be solved rather than tragedies to be mourned. The investigation continued despite the distraction of the correspondence. Detectives pursued legitimate leads, interviewed credible witnesses, analysed physical evidence according to the limited methods available. But the letters had changed the nature of the case irrevocably, transforming it from a police investigation into a cultural phenomenon that would persist long after the official investigation had stalled and been quietly abandoned. The lies contained in the letters, the false claims of authorship, the invented details, the theatrical posturing, became as much a part of the Ripper legend as the actual murders. Future generations would struggle to separate truth from fabrication. The historical record contaminated by fraud perpetrated for profit or attention. The letters and the lies they contained would prove as enduring as the inkblots drawn in blood, both becoming elements of a mystery that would never be definitively solved. Chapter 10. The Fading Trail. December brought winter's full force to London. The fog thickened, ice formed in the gutters, and the poor huddled in whatever shelter they could find against the cold. The gas lamps burned through longer hours as darkness claimed more of each day. The streets that had been sites of murder in autumn now were merely streets again. Their routines restored, the immediate panic subsiding into a more manageable anxiety that became part of daily life. No further murders occurred after Mary Jane Kelly's death on November the 9th. The women of Whitechapel returned gradually to their corners, the economic necessity of survival overcoming fear. The vigilance committees maintained their patrols, but with declining enthusiasm as weeks passed without incident. The newspapers, having exhausted speculation about the existing murders, turned their attention to other scandals and sensations. The investigation continued, but with decreasing urgency and diminishing resources. Inspector Abberline remained convinced that the killer had not simply stopped of his own volition. Men who killed with such deliberation, who took such time with their work, who created elaborate patterns in blood. Such men did not typically cease their activities merely because they chose to. Something had changed. Either the killer had died, had been imprisoned for unrelated offences, had left London, or had been committed to an asylum. But determining which of these possibilities was correct proved impossible. The police reviewed deaths recorded in November and December, seeking any that might represent the killer's end. Men of appropriate age had died from various causes, disease, accident, violence, but none could be definitively connected to the murders. The asylums were contacted, asked to report any recent admissions whose symptoms or statements suggested involvement in the Whitechapel crimes. Several patients claimed to be Jack the Ripper, but investigation revealed these were delusional individuals with no credible connection to the actual murders. Prison records were examined, checking for men incarcerated shortly after Kelly's death who might have been prevented from continuing their work by detention. Several violent criminals were investigated, their whereabouts on the murder nights checked, but none could be placed at the relevant scenes at the relevant times. The investigation generated more paperwork, more files, more reports that led nowhere. The political pressure that had driven such intensive investigation gradually lessened. Parliament turned its attention to other matters. The Home Secretary ceased his daily demands for updates. Sir Charles Warren resigned as Commissioner of Police on November the 9th, the day Kelly's body was discovered, his departure attributed officially to unrelated policy disputes, but understood by everyone as a consequence of the force's failure to apprehend the Whitechapel murderer. Their files remained open, but active investigation diminished. Detectives were reassigned to other cases, other crimes that seemed more susceptible to the solution. Inspector Abberline continued to review incoming information, following up on tips that seemed credible, but the flow of useful intelligence had slowed to a trickle. The hundreds of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper continued to arrive, but they were filed with minimal analysis, recognised as irrelevant to the actual investigation. The Inkblot patterns that had seemed so significant during the active investigation gradually became less central to police thinking. They had been documented, photographed, analysed by various experts, yet no one had been able to determine their meaning or use them to identify the killer. The patterns existed in the files as curiosities, evidence of the killer's peculiar method but not tools that aided in his capture. Some investigators theorized that the patterns were keys to understanding the killer's mind, that decoding their meaning might reveal his identity or motive. But what meaning could symmetrical designs drawn in blood possibly contain? Were they religious symbols, though no religious tradition could be found that used such marks? Were they artistic expressions, the killer viewing his murders as a form of dark creativity? Were they signatures, meant to claim ownership of the crimes? Or were they simply the compulsive behaviour of a disordered mind, meaningless outside the internal logic of insanity? The absence of further murders supported the theory that the killer was dead or incarcerated. If he lived and remained free in London, why had the murders ceased so abruptly? The progression from August through November had shown escalating frequency and violence, culminating in the extended horror of Miller's Court. Such escalation typically continued until the perpetrator was stopped by external force, arrest, death, or physical inability to continue. Voluntary cessation seemed psychologically implausible for someone who had demonstrated such compulsion and taken such risks. Yet without a body or a suspect, the theory of the killer's death remained unprovable. London registered thousands of deaths each month. Many bodies went unidentified, buried in paupers' graves with no investigation into their identities or histories. If the Ripper had died alone in a lodging house, his body might have been removed and buried with no one ever knowing who he had been. The theory that he had left London seemed equally plausible and equally impossible to confirm. Ships departed daily from the docks, carrying passengers to ports throughout the Empire and beyond. No passenger manifests included questions about whether travellers might be wanted for murder. A man with money could disappear into any of a dozen foreign cities, could establish a new identity, could continue his work in places where police forces were less developed and crimes less thoroughly investigated. The investigation into foreign possibilities proceeded slowly. Scotland Yard contacted police departments in major cities, Paris, Berlin, New York, Boston, inquiring whether similar murders had occurred in their jurisdictions. The responses were mixed. Some cities reported murders with superficial similarities. Prostitutes killed, bodies mutilated, but none displayed the distinctive characteristics of the Whitechapel crimes. The anatomical precision, the time taken at scenes, the drawing of symmetrical patterns, these elements appeared unique to the London murders. Theories about the killer's identity proliferated in the absence of definitive evidence. Some investigators believed he must be a doctor or medical student, given the anatomical knowledge displayed. Others argued he might be a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, accustomed to cutting flesh and unfazed by blood. A few suggested he could be a member of the upper classes, someone with education and resources who moved through the East End as a kind of dark tourism, killing for pleasure or perverse experimentation. The theory that attracted most attention within certain circles was that the killer might be royal or aristocratic, that his identity was being protected by forces more powerful than the police. This theory was unprovable and likely false, based more on class resentment and conspiracy thinking than on actual evidence. But it persisted, fed by the investigation's failure and the human tendency to find elaborate explanations for events that defied simple understanding. Inspector Abberline rejected such theories as distraction from the practical work of investigation. In his experience, most crimes were committed by ordinary people for ordinary reasons, anger, greed, lust, or madness being adequate motivation without invoking conspiracies involving the highest levels of society. The Whitechapel murders were unusual in their violence and the skill displayed, but that made the killer unusual, not necessarily aristocratic or protected by powerful interests. The The year turned from 1888 to 1889, and still no arrest had been made. The file on the Whitechapel murders filled several cabinets at Scotland Yard, thousands of pages documenting interviews, theories, leads pursued and abandoned. The photographs and sketches of the Inkblot patterns remained in their folders, occasionally removed for review when new information emerged that might relate to their interpretation. But such moments became increasingly rare as the case aged and attention moved elsewhere. In February 1889, a body was found in a railway arch near Pigeon Street, headless and severely mutilated. The police investigated whether this might represent a resumption of the Ripper's work, but the differences were significant. No Inkblot pattern had been left. The level of anatomical knowledge displayed was less sophisticated. The location was different from the previous murder sites. Most investigators concluded this was a different killer, someone inspired perhaps by the Whitechapel murders, but not the same hand that had killed Mary Jane Kelly. Similar investigations occurred sporadically over the following years. Bodies were discovered with mutilations that reminded people of the Ripper murders, and each generated renewed attention and speculation. But none displayed all the characteristics of the original crimes, and none led to arrests or solutions. The Whitechapel murders remained unique, unclaimed by any killer, except through fraudulent letters, unsolved despite the resources devoted to their investigation. Inspector Abberline was transferred from Whitechapel in 1892. His years of service in H Division concluded. He continued with the Metropolitan Police until his retirement in 1892, working other cases, achieving other successes, but always conscious that his most notorious investigation had ended in failure. In later years, he would occasionally be contacted by researchers or journalists asking about the Ripper case, and he would share what he remembered, always careful to distinguish between what he knew with certainty and what remained speculation. Dr. Phillips continued his work as divisional police surgeon until his retirement, conducting post-mortem examinations on countless bodies, few of which attracted any public attention. The 5 women he had examined in the autumn of 1888 remained distinct in his memory. The precision of their injuries unlike anything else he had encountered in his career. The lodging houses of Whitechapel continued to fill each night with people needing beds. Dorset Street remained a centre of crime and poverty. Miller's Court was occupied by new residents who tried not to think about what had occurred in those rooms. The streets where women had died returned to their normal functions, murder becoming history, the present always more pressing than the past. The files at Scotland Yard remained officially open, the investigation never formally closed. But as years passed and all those directly involved in the case aged and died, the practical investigation ended. What remained was documentation, physical evidence preserved in storage, photographs that showed bodies and crime scenes and patterns drawn in blood by hands that had never been identified. The trail had faded not through dramatic revelation or sudden solution, but through the gradual accumulation of time and the erosion of immediate memory. The killer, whoever he had been, had achieved what few criminals managed. He had escaped capture, evaded justice, and passed into legend. The inkblots he had drawn remained in police files as the most distinctive evidence of his work. Symmetrical patterns that might have meant everything or nothing, created by someone who understood their significance, even if no one else ever would. The fading trail led into darkness and ended there, leaving behind only questions that would echo through subsequent generations, asked and re-asked by those who studied the case, seeking answers that the Victorian police, despite all their efforts and expertise, had failed to find. Chapter 11. The Silence That Remains. The 20th century arrived, and with it came technologies that would have transformed the Whitechapel investigation had they existed in 1888. Fingerprint identification was adopted by Scotland Yard in 1901, providing a scientific method for connecting suspects to crime scenes. Blood typing was discovered in 1900, offering the potential to distinguish one person's blood from another's. Photography improved, cameras became portable, electric lighting made documentation of dark spaces practical. Yet these advances came too late for the 5 women whose murders remained unsolved. Inspector Frederick Abberline lived until 1929, dying at the age of 86 in Bournemouth, far from the streets of Whitechapel where he had spent so many years. In his final decades, he gave occasional interviews about the Ripper case, always careful, always reluctant to speculate beyond what evidence supported. He never claimed to know the killer's identity, never endorsed the theories that multiplied in books and articles. He knew what the files contained, knew how little certainty existed beneath the accumulated speculation. The silence he maintained was professional, the acknowledgement that some questions simply had no answers. Dr. Thomas Bond, who had reviewed the medical evidence and attempted to create what might be called a psychological profile of the killer, died in 1901. His conclusion that the murderer was not a medical man but rather someone who killed under the influence of periodic homicidal mania had been controversial, contradicting the anatomical evidence observed by other physicians. But his willingness to consider the psychological dimensions of the crimes represented an advance in thinking about murder investigation, even if his specific conclusions proved unprovable. The 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, were buried in paupers' graves, their funerals attended by crowds, but their graves eventually lost to record as cemeteries were reorganized and headstones removed. They existed now primarily in police files and newspaper accounts, their lives reduced to the manner of their deaths, their humanity subsumed into their role as victims. The silence of their graves was literal, their voices preserved only through the fragmentary accounts of those who had known them briefly in life. The files at Scotland Yard remained in storage, occasionally accessed by researchers given permission to study the case. The photographs of the Inkblot patterns were examined by various experts over the decades: psychologists, artists, anthropologists, criminologists, each bringing different methodologies to bear on the question of what these symmetrical designs might reveal about the mind that created them. No consensus emerged. The patterns remained enigmatic, perhaps meaningful only to the person who had drawn them, perhaps meaningless even to him. In 1959, Daniel Farson produced a television documentary about the Ripper murders, bringing the case to new audiences who knew nothing of Victorian London or the social conditions that had existed in Whitechapel. The documentary popularised certain theories about the killer's identity, most of which were based on speculation rather than evidence. The pattern established by Farson's work would be repeated countless times in subsequent decades. Books, television programmes, films, all claiming to solve the mystery, all presenting theories that could not be definitively proven or disproven. The silence of certainty was filled with noise of speculation. Each new book claimed to have discovered the truth that all previous investigators had missed. Suspects were proposed, their cases built from fragmentary evidence and logical inference. Some theories were more plausible than others, but plausibility was not proof, and proof was the one thing that could never be obtained more than a century after the crimes. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher whose body was found in the Thames in December 1888, became a favoured suspect for some theorists. His death occurred shortly after the final canonical murder. His family apparently believed him capable of violence, and private notes by police officials mentioned him as a possibility. But no direct evidence connected him to any of the crime scenes. No witness identified him, no physical proof linked him to the murders. The case against Druitt was circumstantial, built on timing and speculation rather than demonstrable fact. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who was committed to an asylum in 1891, appeared in police memoranda as another suspect. His mental illness, his residence in Whitechapel, and the timing of his institutionalization made him superficially plausible. But again, no evidence existed beyond administrative notes written years after the crimes, and the reliability of such notes was questionable given the errors and contradictions they contained. Dozens of other suspects were proposed over the decades. Doctors, artists, midwives, royals, members of secret societies. Each theory required the dismissal of evidence that contradicted it, the acceptance of speculation as fact, the construction of narratives that filled gaps in the historical record with invention. The industry of Ripper studies became self-perpetuating, each generation of researchers examining the same limited evidence and reaching different conclusions based more on the methodology and assumptions they brought to the material than on any new information discovered. The Metropolitan Police officially closed the case in the late 20th century, acknowledging that no solution would be forthcoming, that everyone involved had been dead for decades, that justice in any meaningful sense was impossible. The files were eventually made available to researchers, digitized and published online, allowing anyone with interest to examine the primary documents. But greater access to evidence did not produce greater consensus about interpretation. If anything, the multiplication of theories accelerated as more people applied their attention to the material. The Inkblot patterns, those symmetrical designs drawn in blood at crime scenes, became subjects of particular fascination. Psychologists analysed them as possible Rorschach-like projections of the killer's mental state. Artists examined them for technique and aesthetic sensibility. Cryptographers attempted to decode them as messages or maps. Occultists suggested they were ritual symbols drawn from esoteric traditions. Each analysis revealed more about the assumptions of the analyzer than about the mind of the killer. The patterns had been whitewashed from the walls where they appeared. The wood of the fence at Hanbury Street had long since rotted and been replaced. The building at Miller's Court had been demolished. Only the photographs remained, black and white images of varying quality, some clear and detailed, others muddy and indistinct. The original bloodstains were gone, the physical evidence lost to time, and the practical necessity of cleaning crime scenes and returning properties to use. Whitechapel itself transformed over the decades following the murders. The worst slums were gradually cleared, replaced by social housing and commercial development. The lodging houses were closed or converted to other uses. The streets were widened and straightened. The district gentrified slowly through the latter half of the 20th century, the poverty that had defined it in the Victorian era giving way to development and renewal. By the early 21st century, Whitechapel bore little physical resemblance to the district where the murders had occurred, but the memory persisted. Walking tours were established, guides leading groups of tourists to the approximate locations of the murders, telling the stories, showing photographs of how the streets had appeared in 1888. The tours were popular, the horror of the crimes exercising an attraction that survived more than a century. People wanted to stand where victims had stood, to imagine the darkness and fear, to experience vicariously a fragment of the terror that had gripped Victorian London. The commercialisation of the murders troubled some observers, who saw in it a disrespect for the victims, a transformation of tragedy into entertainment. Others argued that remembering the crime served a purpose, that the continued attention ensured the women were not forgotten, even if they were primarily remembered for how they died rather than how they lived. The debate continued, unresolved, reflecting broader questions about how societies should remember their darkest moments. Academic study of the case produced shelves of books examining every aspect of the crimes, the social conditions of Victorian Whitechapel, the development of police investigative techniques, the role of the press in shaping public perception, the psychological profiles of serial killers, the treatment of women in Victorian society. The murders became a lens through which to examine Victorian culture, revealing assumptions and structures that might otherwise have remained invisible in the historical record. The silence that remained was not the silence of forgetting, but rather the silence of the unanswerable. The basic facts were known. 5 women killed in a distinctive manner over a period of 3 months in 1888. Their murders never solved despite intensive investigation. Everything beyond those basic facts existed in the realm of probability and speculation rather than certainty. The killer's identity, his motive, the meaning of the Inkblot patterns, what became of him after the murders ceased. These questions had no definitive answers. Some silences were more troubling than others. The voices of the victims themselves were largely lost, their perspectives unrecorded, their lives known only through the fragmentary accounts of others. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, they existed in history primarily as victims, their agency and humanity obscured by the manner of their deaths. Efforts to recover their stories, to understand them as full human beings rather than merely as murder victims, came late and were hindered by the limited documentation that Victorian society created about the lives of poor women. The silence of the killer was perhaps inevitable. Had he been caught, had he stood trial, had he provided confession or explanation, much might have been clarified. But he escaped justice. His voice never added to the historical record except through letters that were almost certainly fraudulent. His silence allowed the projection of countless theories onto the blank space where his testimony should have been. He became whatever theorists needed him to be, mad or sane, brilliant or ordinary, driven by comprehensible motives or by impulses that defied understanding. Inspector Abberline's silence in his later years reflected the professional restraint of a man who understood the difference between certainty and speculation. He knew what the evidence proved and what it did not prove. He recognized that his years of investigation had failed to produce the result everyone desired. He refused to endorse theories that went beyond what evidence supported, even when such endorsement might have brought him attention or financial reward from publishers seeking sensational revelations. The patterns drawn in blood at the crime scenes remained the most distinctive physical evidence of the killer's presence, yet also the most mysterious. Their symmetry suggested deliberation. Their variation suggested evolution of technique. Their presence suggested they served some purpose for the person who created them. But what purpose? Were they signatures, meant to identify his work? Were they messages, communicating something to an audience he imagined or desired? Were they compulsions, behaviours he could not resist even when they increased his risk of capture? Or were they simply artistic expressions, the work of someone who saw beauty in symmetry and had access only to blood as medium? The silence of definitive interpretation allowed each generation to project its own understanding onto the patterns. 20th century psychologists saw them as expressions of psychological disorder. 21st century researchers examined them through the lens of criminal profiling and behavioral analysis. Artists considered them as aesthetic objects, divorced from the horror of their creation. Each interpretation added layers of meaning, while the original meaning, if any existed, remained inaccessible. The case entered popular culture, inspiring countless works of fiction, novels, films, television series, with theatrical productions. These creative works took the basic facts and elaborated them into narratives that required the invention of details and the creation of explanations where history provided none. Some were respectful to the victims, attempting to restore their humanity. Others exploited the sensational elements, focusing on the killer and the horror rather than on the lives destroyed. The boundary between historical study and entertainment blurred, the murders becoming a cultural property that anyone could appropriate and reshape according to their purposes. The silence that remained was ultimately the silence of history itself when faced with the limits of evidence. No amount of research or analysis could recover what had never been documented. The crucial moments, the encounters between killer and victims, the conversations, if any, occurred, the final minutes of 5 women's lives, existed in a space beyond historical recovery. They could be imagined, reconstructed based on physical evidence and logical inference, but they could never be known with the certainty that justice and understanding required. The files at Scotland Yard, now digitised and accessible to researchers worldwide, contained everything the Victorian police had collected: thousands of pages of witness statements, medical reports, memoranda, photographs, sketches. They represented a remarkable effort at documentation, particularly for an era when criminal investigation was still developing its methods and procedures. But even this extensive documentation proved inadequate to answer the questions that mattered most. Who had killed these women? Why had he killed them? What had the patterns meant? Where had he gone when the murders ceased? The 20th century ended and the 21st began, and still the questions persisted. New technologies were applied to old evidence, DNA testing of items from the crime scenes, though contamination and degradation limited what could be learned. Statistical analysis of criminal behaviour patterns, though applied to crimes more than a century old. Geographical profiling, attempting to locate the killer's base of operations through the distribution of crime scenes. Each methodology produced results that were interesting but ultimately inconclusive, adding to the body of speculation without resolving the fundamental mysteries. The 5 women remained in their unmarked graves, their bones long since returned to earth. The streets where they died continued to carry traffic, the physical spaces transformed beyond recognition. The buildings where their bodies had lain were demolished or renovated, every trace of blood and violence erased by time and the practical needs of the living. The gas lamps that had provided inadequate light were replaced by electric illumination, then by LED. The darkness that had aided the killer, banished by technologies he could never have imagined. But the silence remained. The silence of questions without answers. The silence of victims whose voices were lost. The silence of a killer who escaped justice and carried his secrets to whatever end he met. The silence of patterns drawn in blood whose meaning died with the hand that created them. The silence that falls over history when evidence ends and speculation begins, when the knowable gives way to the unknowable, when certainty dissolves into the fog of time. The Bedside Historian offers no solutions, no revelation of hidden truth, no claim to have decoded what others missed. The story of the Whitechapel murderers is a story of silence, the silence that followed the screams, the silence of closed files and cold cases, the silence that persists despite the noise of endless theorizing. It is the silence of history acknowledging its limits, of justice denied, of questions posed but never answered. The night has grown late, and this particular journey through the past has reached its end. The candles burn low, the darkness presses close, and history, having shown what it can show and concealed what it must conceal, turns the page and moves forward, leaving behind only the silence that remains. Profound and permanent, a mystery that time could not solve and that death has placed forever beyond reach. Sleep well.